Hey, why don't you come to Mom's funeral, sis? What? I never thought you were such a terrible person. I was caught off guard as my younger brother's words pierced through the phone line. His tearful voice held no hint of deceit. James, Mom passed away 5 years ago, you know. My name is Jessica, I reminded him gently. I'm a 30-year-old office worker dating a man named Robert. We're starting to get serious, and he's eager to meet my parents. But there's a weight of guilt pressing on me. Both my parents have passed away, having divorced years ago amidst irreconcilable differences. I was just 16 then. After the divorce, I lived with my father, who cared for me deeply. He supported my piano lessons and studies, and I took on household chores in return, cooking dinner, making rice balls, anything to see his smile of approval. Then came college, where I excelled, much to my father's pride. He encouraged me to visit my mother, who lived with my younger brother James. Big sister Jessica, long time no see. We shared brief moments of joy during those visits. But after my mother remarried, things changed. My husband-to-be wanted me to focus on our life together, which strained my relationship with my previous family. Though I wished them happiness, conflicting emotions swirled within me as I navigated this new chapter of my life. But I don't want to lose the opportunity to see my brother. Can't we just reduce the frequency of our meetings? I'm sorry, but James is entering adolescence and I don't want to confuse him too much. I see, but once we get used to our new life, I'm sure my husband will let us meet. Yeah, I understand. I wasn't entirely convinced, but I didn't want to protest and risk damaging my mother and brother's relationship with their new family. So, I decided to endure it. Years passed. I finished college and landed a job. Yet during that time, I couldn't see my brother or mother. 4 years had gone by, and I couldn't help but wonder why they couldn't spare even a moment to meet me. Perhaps they were leading such fulfilling lives that they no longer needed me. My brother, who was just 11 when we last met, was now 15. I wanted to offer him some encouragement as he prepared for private high school entrance exams. With that thought in mind, I mustered the courage to call my mother. To my surprise, an unfamiliar man answered the phone. Hello, who is this? Isn't this my mother's number? Are you Jessica by any chance? Yes, I am. I'm David, the man who remarried your mother. She's busy right now, so I answered the phone. Oh, I see. Well, it's been 4 years since I last saw them, and I was thinking I'd like to see my brother and mother soon. Really? You haven't seen them? No, I haven't seen them at all. I see. Maybe your mother doesn't want to see you. What? Actually, when I mentioned your name just now, my wife didn't react at all. Is James not around? I at least want my brother to respond to my call. I was thinking that, but James is right next to me. He's just playing a game and not reacting at all. It seems like they've both forgotten about you and adapted to their current lives. They're both living happily, so could you please leave them alone? I'm gonna hang up now, David stated before ending the call. I was left so stunned that I couldn't move for a while after the conversation ended. The thought that my brother and mother might have forgotten about me and were living their lives without me was too much to bear. Seeking solace, I turned to my father for advice. That's strange. Those two love you, Jessica, he reassured me. He tried to reach out to my mother, but her response was firm. Please don't call again. In the end, we couldn't meet or even speak to my mother and brother. Life carried on, and I became increasingly occupied with work. Still, they lingered in the back of my mind. Then, about 3 years after that distressing phone call, I received devastating news. What? Mom. It was a notification informing me that my mother had died in a traffic accident. Rushing to the hospital, I was led to the room where her lifeless body lay. Her peaceful expression made it seem as if she were merely sleeping with her eyes closed. I never imagined I'd see her again like this. Sis, a voice broke through my mourning. James. As I grieved my mother's passing, my brother entered the room. It had been 7 long years since I last saw him, and he had grown into a completely different person. Why didn't you come to see us? He questioned, his tone filled with hurt. Did you start hating me and Mom? Wait a minute, I interjected. It was your stepfather, David, who told me not to see you. Dad would never say something like that, James rebutted firmly. Dad's an amazing person, and I look up to him. He wouldn't say something like not meeting with you, sis. What? My brother's trust in our stepfather, David, was evident. They must have developed a strong bond over the past 7 years. Then, a man who seemed to be David arrived. "Hi, it's our first time meeting in person, isn't it?" he greeted. "Hello." David appeared to be in his early 50s with a determined air about him, as if he could accomplish anything. Despite encountering various company employees in my line of work, he struck me as somewhat cunning. "I'm really shocked that my wife passed away so suddenly. The funeral will be held soon, so I'd like both you and your father to attend, Jessica," David informed me. Understood. Though my mind was preoccupied, attending my mother's funeral took precedence. My father and I went together to bid her farewell. The funeral proceeded without incident, but a dispute over the inheritance soon arose. "Jessica hasn't seen my wife in 7 years, so could you please give up the inheritance?" David proposed. "What? Wait a minute," I interjected. "Wasn't it David who didn't let me see her?" "Sis, are you still saying that? How many times do I have to explain that Dad would never do that?" James countered. No matter how desperately I pleaded, my brother wouldn't believe me. "Oh dear, it seems I've become the villain here," David remarked. "Dad's not wrong. Sis is just saying weird things," James asserted. "Sis, I don't really understand inheritance, but will you give it up?" he pressed. "What? I should at least receive the minimum inheritance, right? What would Mom think if she saw you being so greedy about money?" I retorted, feeling as though David treated me as if I were money-grubbing. At this point, my father intervened. "Wait a minute, my daughter is only claiming her rightful share. Stop making such accusations." Thanks to my father's words, David fell silent. "No matter what you say, I'll make sure my daughter gets at least the minimum inheritance." "What's this? Are you and Sis conspiring to make things difficult for us?" David challenged. "That's not the case. This is just a claim of rights," my father clarified. The discussion grew heated, and in the end, I received only the minimum inheritance, but it created a divide between my brother and me. My antagonistic relationship with David, my brother's trusted stepfather, caused this rupture. Finally reconnecting with my brother after so long, only to be met with his disdain, compounded the sadness of losing my mother. As if that weren't enough, more misfortune followed. My father was diagnosed with cancer, given only 1 more year to live. It felt like an onslaught of crushing blows, leaving me asking, "Why is this happening to me?" I spiraled into negativity. But my father, noticing my change, gently spoke to me. "Jessica, everyone dies someday. It's not something we can control. I've been happy living with you all this time, and I intend to enjoy the time I have left to the fullest." Dad? In the time that remained, we went on trips and did everything he wanted to do. When he passed away, I was left with an unbearable pain from losing both of my beloved parents. Yet my father's last words echoed in my mind: "Look forward and enjoy every moment of life." With his words as my guide, I wiped away my tears and chose to move forward. At my father's funeral, my brother arrived, accompanied by David. This presence fueled my brother's aggression towards me, his focus solely on my father's inheritance. "Sis, you forcibly took part of Mom's inheritance, so I'm definitely taking Dad's inheritance," he asserted. I didn't want to engage in further conflict or hostility, so I quietly agreed. "Yes, of course, I was planning to give it to you anyway," I responded calmly, making arrangements for the inheritance to be transferred to my brother. Since then, I haven't seen or heard from my brother. It felt awkward reaching out to him, and years passed by. Eventually, I met Robert through a friend's introduction. As our relationship progressed towards marriage, I decided to disclose everything to him about the loss of both my parents and the strained relationship with my only sibling, my brother. Despite knowing all this, Robert still wanted to marry me, and I found myself falling in love with him. As our courtship continued smoothly and we received a marriage proposal, I felt like I was on top of the world. But then, in a sudden twist, I received a call from my brother. "Hello, James," I greeted, surprised and elated to hear from him after so long. "What's up?" "Oh, speaking of which, I have something to tell you too." However, before I could say anything, my brother interrupted me with an accusation that left me bewildered. "Sis, why didn't you come to Mom's funeral? I never thought you were such a terrible person," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "What? I don't think my sister was such a terrible person," I responded, utterly confused by his sudden accusation over the phone. "What's going on? Why are you saying something so nonsensical all of a sudden?" "Nonsensical? Mom's dead, you know," he retorted, his voice filled with anguish. "Wait, James, calm down. I urged, struggling to make sense of the situation. How can I calm down? Was this some kind of cruel joke? He questioned, his voice breaking. No, it was too harsh for that, I realized, feeling the weight of the truth in my brother's sobbing voice. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before addressing my brother James. James, Mom died 5 years ago. I began slowly, expecting him to understand. But his response shocked me to the core. What are you talking about? Mom didn't die back then. What? What are you saying? You saw Mom's body too, didn't you? We even had the funeral, I countered, confusion clouding my thoughts. His insistence only added to my bewilderment. No, Mom was alive. I lived with her for about 3 years after that. What? What do you mean? James's voice trembled with disbelief. So, I was living with Mom, I tried to explain, struggling to grasp the situation myself. It's best to go along with the story at times like this, I reasoned, trying to make sense of the apparent disconnect. Yes, but they said she would die soon without an offering. I gave all the money I earned as an offering, James confessed, his voice heavy with regret. Suddenly, it dawned on me that my brother had been deceived. What? At that moment, I realized that my brother had been deceived, but the offering wasn't enough, and Mom died. James, can you introduce me to the person you've been making offerings to? I asked urgently, wanting to understand the full extent of the deception. Of course, you should be saved too, sis, he responded earnestly, leading me to the person who had supposedly rescued Mom. Later, as we entered the office building where counseling was conducted, I felt a sense of unease. Teacher, my brother called out as we stepped into the private office. And there, to my astonishment, was David. Wait a minute, you're the one who remarried my mother and became James's stepfather, right? Why is James calling you teacher? I demanded, my confusion growing. James and I have a patient-teacher relationship, David explained calmly, though his presence only fueled my suspicion. What? No, you live with James, right? James even called you Dad, I protested, struggling to comprehend the situation. Sis, what are you talking about? David is a counselor. Dad died 3 years ago, remember? James interjected, his voice tinged with concern. Wait, David, are you brainwashing James? I accused, unable to shake off the feeling of dread creeping over me. What are you talking about? I've just been listening to him. Before that, I was counseling his mother, David clarified, though his explanation did little to alleviate my growing unease. What? You deceived my mother too, I accused, feeling a surge of anger and betrayal. Sis, don't say such terrible things like deceived, James pleaded, his expression torn between confusion and distress. Jessica seems quite confused. Well, it's understandable. Losing both parents can often lead to mental illness, David interjected, his tone patronizing. What are you talking about? You've unconsciously put a stopper in your mind to avoid facing reality. You're suppressing the grief of losing your parents, he concluded, his words sending a chill down my spine. I can help you release it. Stop it. I'm already looking forward and living my life. Really? Aren't you just enduring it? I'm not enduring anything. It's better not to force yourself. If you do as I say, your heart will feel much lighter. Really? Really? James became cheerful that way too, so why not entrust yourself to me? Yes, please. Good girl. Now, sit here and think about your mom and dad. When I place my hands on your head, the sad feelings will magically disappear. How about it? Do you feel lighter? No, I don't feel any lighter. I see. Maybe it's because the offering is 0, so there is not enough power. What? If you really want to get better, you have to make a lot of offerings. Is that so? Yeah, so let's start with an offering of $1,000. $1,000? That's still not enough to be completely healed. You need to make more and more offerings. Is that so? James made offerings too, right? Yes, he's been making offerings ever since he graduated from high school and started working. That's how he was able to find his mother and regain happy days. But the offerings stopped at one point, and his mother really died this time. So, he's reflecting on that and increasing his offerings to be saved. I see. I called out towards the entrance. That's how it is, Robert. As I said that, the door to the room opened, and my fiancé, Robert, walked in. Who exactly are you? David asked, with a suspicious look at Robert, who then handed David his business card. I'm a lawyer. I've been listening to your conversation, and it seems you've been brainwashing James and swindling a large sum of money from him. A lawyer? He's also my fiancé, and we're going to sue you and recover the money." As I said that, David momentarily looked flustered, but then snorted and retorted, "I thought you'd say something like that. James was saved by me. There's no fact that I deceived him. I was just providing legitimate counseling, right, James?" David asked my brother with a triumphant look on his face. My brother glanced at us and then said, "I was deceived by you and forced to contribute a large sum of money." "You, James." David's eyes widened at my brother's statement. "It seems your brother intends to sue you. Wait, this must be some mistake, right, James? I saved you. Are you going to betray me like this?" "Teacher, I do think that thanks to you, both my mother and I felt relieved many times. But it's also true that you were gradually brainwashing us, right? In fact, I became unable to make sound judgments because of you. You brought a woman who looked like my mother and made me believe that she was actually alive. And then, you instilled fear that she would die if I didn't make offerings. Moreover, you disposed of all the photos of my mother and me without my noticing and replaced them with composite photos of a fake mother. The pictures were so sophisticated and natural that I naturally believed the fake mother was my real mother. And before I knew it, almost all of my salary from the years since I graduated from high school and started working was taken by you. When I met my sister and saw the real photos of my mother, the brainwashing suddenly broke. That's when I decided to sue you, capturing evidence if you actually demanding an exorbitant amount of money." You betrayed me," David exclaimed, stunned by my brother's revelation. "Don't mess with me. You're the one who kept swindling money from me and my mother. You brainwashed us, telling us not to meet my sister and even made us lie that you were our stepfather. My mother died without seeing my sister for years. I'll not only get back the money you took from me but also the money you took from my mother. You've sucked money from us and enjoyed yourself. Now suffer misfortune." My brother angrily confronted David with such intensity that David stumbled back in surprise. "Then we'll see you in court," Robert said, and we left the scene. After that, James sued David under Robert's legal representation. David was ordered to pay back the total amount of $300,000 that he had swindled from my brother and mother. Not only was David ordered to pay compensation, but his outrageous fraudulence became known to his previous patients and their families, and he seems to be in serious trouble due to lawsuits and compensation claims from many people. He had been doing as he pleased for so long that he deserved to be punished. I realized that our relationship had been strained because of the brainwashing, and with everything resolved, the resentment between my brother and me disappeared. My brother also attended my wedding with Robert. I hadn't seen my brother for many years because of David, but now I want to fill that gap by regularly meeting and getting along well with my only sibling.
After my sister-in-law's sudden death, her husband moved in with his twins. My husband demanded I quit my job to care for them. When I refused and suggested hiring a maid, he snapped, hitting me on the head with a rolling pin. Bleeding and in pain, I called 911. As I lay in the hospital bed, I made a decision that put him behind bars in just 2 hours. My name is Sandra Carter, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down. I was 30 years old, a financial analyst living in Austin, Texas, and I had a life I thought was perfect until it wasn't. I was married to David Carter, a 35-year-old mechanic. He was hardworking, quiet most of the time, and dependable. At least that's how I used to see him. We had a simple but comfortable life in a modest 3-bedroom house on a quiet street. I worked hard at my job and brought in a stable income. David ran a small auto repair shop on the other side of town. We were a team, or so I believed. Things started changing when David's older brother, Ethan Carter, moved in with us. Ethan was 38, a widower who had just lost his wife, Rachel, to a sudden heart attack. The tragedy hit him hard, and understandably so. He was left with their 4-year-old twins, Liam and Ava, 2 innocent little kids who had no idea what life had just taken from them. David broke the news to me one evening while we were having dinner. "Sandra," he said in a voice that told me something serious was coming, "Ethan needs our help. Rachel's gone, and he doesn't know what to do with the kids." I told him he could come stay with us for a while. I paused, my fork covering midair. "For a while?" I asked cautiously. Yes, just until he gets back on his feet, David replied, almost too quickly. He's going through a tough time, and it's the right thing to do. They don't have anywhere else to go. I won't lie, I was hesitant. I felt sorry for Ethan and the twins, but I also knew what it would mean for us. We weren't exactly living in a mansion, and my life was already busy enough balancing work and managing the house. But I couldn't say no. I told myself it was temporary, and helping family was the right thing to do. 2 days later, Ethan arrived at our doorstep with 2 small suitcases and 2 sleepy kids clutching his hands. I remember the moment vividly. David hugged Ethan tightly, carrying their bags inside, while I crouched down to greet the twins. "Hi, Liam." "Hi, Ava," I said softly, offering a smile. Liam shyly hid behind Ethan, while Ava gave me a half-smile that broke my heart. "It's so good of you to take us in, Sandra," Ethan said, his voice heavy with grief. "It's no problem," I replied warmly, though part of me wondered how long we could manage. At first, I did my best to make them comfortable. I cooked meals for everyone, cleaned up after the kids, and helped Ethan as much as I could. I even rearranged our guest room to give Ethan and the twins some space. But within the first week, it was clear how difficult things were going to be. The twins were too young to understand their mother was gone, and they acted out constantly. Liam cried at night, screaming for Rachel, while Ava threw tantrums over the smallest things. The house was filled with noise, and I barely had a moment to think. David, on the other hand, seemed completely unaffected. In fact, he was happier. He spent all his time with Ethan and the kids, laughing and playing as if we were one big, happy family. But I wasn't happy. I was exhausted. As weeks turned into months, I realized Ethan wasn't making any effort to get back on his feet. He didn't look for a job, and he spent most of his days lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone or watching TV. The twins ran wild in our home, leaving crayon marks on the walls, spilling drinks on the carpet, and breaking things without a care. I tried to talk to David about it. "David, this isn't working," I said one night as we lay in bed. "Ethan needs to start looking for a job. And the kids, the house is a mess. I can't keep up with all of this while working full-time." David frowned, turning toward me. "Sandra, they've been through so much. Ethan lost his wife. He needs time to heal. Why can't you be more understanding?" "I am being understanding," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "But this isn't sustainable. I can't do everything. I think we need to hire someone, a housemaid, maybe to help with the kids." David sat up, his expression darkening. "We're not hiring a maid. That's a waste of money. You're capable of handling it, Sandra. You're just being selfish." I stared at him, shocked. "Selfish?" "David, I'm working all day and cleaning up after 5 people when I get home. How is that selfish?" "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he snapped, turning his back to me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tears stinging my eyes. I felt trapped in my own home. I had always believed David was on my side, but now, it was as if he had turned against me. The tension only grew worse from there. Every time I brought up Ethan's lack of effort or suggested ways to manage the chaos, David dismissed me. And then, the day came when David's demands went too far. One evening, as I served dinner, he said the words that changed everything. "Sandra, you need to quit your job." I froze, the plate of food still in my hand. "What?" "You need to quit your job," David repeated. "Ethan can't handle the kids on his own, and we can't afford a maid. It's only fair that you stay home and take care of them." I put the plate down, my hands trembling. "Are you out of your mind, David? I'm not quitting my job to babysit Ethan's kids. I've worked too hard for my career." David slammed his fork down on the table, his face red with anger. "Ethan needs help. They're family, Sandra. You're supposed to support us, not fight against us." "I have supported you," I shot back. "But I'm not giving up my life for this. It's not fair to me." David glared at me, his jaw tight. "You're being selfish. If you loved me, you'd do this for us." That was the moment I realized David no longer saw me as his partner. He saw me as someone to control. And what happened next would change everything. I wish I could say things got better after that argument, but they didn't. Instead, everything spiraled even further out of control. David refused to let the subject go, bringing it up at every opportunity. "Sandra, you're not being fair to Ethan. You don't understand what he's going through," he would say, as though I was some cold, unfeeling person. It wasn't true. I felt terrible for Ethan, and I cared about the twins, but I wasn't willing to sacrifice my entire life. I had worked hard to become a financial analyst, building a career that gave me independence and pride. Now David wanted me to throw it all away, as if my life didn't matter. One evening, after yet another exhausting day at work, I came home to chaos. The living room looked like a tornado had passed through. Toys were scattered everywhere, juice was spilled across the coffee table, and Liam was jumping on the couch while Ava scribbled with crayons on the wall. Ethan was sitting on the recliner, glued to his phone. "Ethan," I said, trying to stay calm, "can you please help me with the kids? I've been working all day, and I just need a little break." He barely glanced up. "They're fine, Sandra. They're just kids. Relax." Relax? How could I relax when my house was falling apart? I turned to David, who had just walked in, and I couldn't hold back anymore. "David, this has to stop," I said, my voice shaking. "The house is a disaster. Ethan isn't even trying to look for work, and the kids—" "Stop it, Sandra." David snapped, cutting me off. "You're always complaining. Can't you see we're doing the best we can?" "The best you can?" I shot back, feeling my anger bubble over. "I'm the one who's working full-time and cleaning up after everyone. I'm exhausted, David. I can't keep living like this." David's face darkened, and he stepped toward me, his voice low and threatening. "I told you what you need to do, Sandra. Quit your job and take care of things here. This is your responsibility." I stood my ground, refusing to back down. "No, David. I won't quit my job. If you want help, hire a maid. That's the only solution." The moment I said it, I knew it would set him off. David's expression twisted in anger, his fists clenching at his sides. The room fell silent except for the sound of the twins playing in the background. David stormed into the kitchen, muttering under his breath. I followed him, ready to argue my point further, but before I could say anything, it happened. He grabbed the rolling pin from the counter, turning toward me with rage in his eyes. "David, what are you doing?" I whispered, fear gripping me as I took a step back. "You just don't get it, Sandra," he shouted, and before I could move, he swung the rolling pin with brutal force. The pain exploded through my head like a bomb. I felt the world spin as I stumbled backward, crashing to the floor. My vision blurred, and I could hear the distant sound of Ava giggling from the other room, completely unaware of what had just happened. I lay there for a moment, unable to move, my head throbbing as warm blood trickled down the side of my face. I could barely make out David standing over me, frozen in shock, his face pale. I didn't mean," he stammered, but his voice sounded far away. Somehow, I managed to summon the strength to move. My hand fumbled in my pocket for my phone. Everything hurt, my head, my body, my heart, but I knew I had to call for help. 911, I whispered into the phone, my voice weak. "Please help me." I don't remember much after that. I vaguely recall the paramedics arriving, their faces blurry as they leaned over me, asking me questions I couldn't answer. The last thing I saw before slipping into unconsciousness was David standing in the corner, his hands still trembling. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Bright lights glared down at me, and the sound of beeping machines echoed in the quiet room. My head was bandaged, and the pain was still there, though dulled by the medication they had given me. A nurse was standing beside me, her voice kind but professional. "Sandra, you're in the hospital. You suffered a head injury, but you're going to be okay." I nodded weakly, tears stinging my eyes as the memories came flooding back. The argument. The rolling pin. David's face as he realized what he'd done. The nurse must have seen the look on my face, because she gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "The police are here, Sandra. They need to talk to you." The police? My heart pounded. I hadn't even thought about what would happen next. I didn't want to think about David, about what he had done to me, but deep down, I knew I couldn't let this go. When the officer walked into my room, his face serious and concerned, I took a deep breath. It was time to tell the truth. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened?" I nodded, my voice trembling as I began to speak. I told him everything about the arguments, the stress, the rolling pin. I didn't leave anything out. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. The officer wrote everything down, his expression grave. "We'll take care of this, Sandra. Don't worry. You did the right thing." As he left the room, I lay back on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I realized that David had crossed a line I could never forgive. He had betrayed me, not just as a husband, but as a human being. That night, as I lay alone in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, my pain began to turn into something else, determination. David thought he could hurt me and get away with it. But he was wrong. I was going to make sure he paid for what he did. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I would not let David get away with what he did to me. I had spent years supporting him, loving him, believing we were a team. And what did I get in return? A brutal betrayal. A rolling pin to the head. That night, something inside me hardened. I would take my life back, and David would pay for every ounce of pain he caused me. The next morning, I woke up determined. My head still throbbed, and the bruises on my face were visible in the small mirror on the hospital wall. I looked at myself, pale, broken, but alive. And that was enough. I wasn't just a victim. I was stronger than this. The doctors ran more tests and confirmed I had a severe concussion, but I would recover with rest. My sister, Megan, came to visit me that afternoon. She had flown in from San Antonio the moment she heard what had happened. Seeing her face made me burst into tears. I hadn't let myself cry until then. "Oh, Sandra," Megan said, sitting beside me and holding my hand. "What did he do to you?" I told her everything. Every argument, every demand David had made, and how it all ended with him losing control. Megan listened, anger flashing in her eyes. "He's not going to get away with this," she said firmly. "I know," I whispered. "I'm going to make sure of that." After a few days, I was discharged from the hospital. I still felt weak, but the fire inside me burned brighter than ever. I had a plan and I was going to follow through. The first thing I did was gather all the evidence. I requested a copy of my medical report. It detailed my head injury, the bruising, and how I ended up in the hospital. I asked Megan to take photos of my bruises while they were still fresh. Every mark on my body was proof of David's violence. I wasn't going to let him hide what he had done. Next, I contacted the hospital staff and asked for written statements. The doctors and nurses remembered me clearly, the bruising, the confusion, and how I whispered that I had been attacked by my husband. They didn't hesitate to put it in writing. Once I had everything I needed, I made the call to the police. "Hello, this is Sandra Carter," I said, my voice steady. "I want to file a complaint for physical assault and domestic violence." The officer I spoke to was professional and patient, walking me through the process. I handed over my medical records, the photos, and the witness statements. Every piece of evidence painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. The next day, 2 officers arrived at our house. David wasn't expecting it. I wasn't there to see it happen, but Megan told me how they knocked on the door and arrested him right in the living room. He had the nerve to call me from the police station later that evening. "Sandra, what the hell did you do?" he shouted. "You called the cops on me?" I held the phone tightly in my hand, my voice calm. "Yes, David. I did. You hit me. You tried to break me, but you failed. You're going to face the consequences for what you did." He started shouting again, but I hung up. That was the last time I heard his voice for a while. The legal process moved quickly. My evidence was strong, and I had the police and hospital records to back me up. David's lawyer tried to argue that it was a moment of rage and not intentional, but no one believed it. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, and certainly not me. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. I sat in the courtroom, surrounded by Megan and my closest friends. David sat across the room, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He didn't even look at me. The prosecutor laid out the facts clearly. Mr. Carter assaulted his wife, Mrs. Sandra Carter, causing severe head injuries. The evidence speaks for itself: medical reports, photographs, and witness statements. David's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, but it was no use. The judge's voice echoed through the room as he delivered the sentence. David Carter, you are hereby sentenced to 3 years in prison for physical assault and domestic violence. Additionally, the court will seize control of your property and savings to ensure financial penalties for your actions. Hearing those words was like taking a breath of fresh air. For the first time in months, I felt free. David's face went pale. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if he couldn't believe this was happening. But it was too late for regret. As I walked out of that courtroom with Megan by my side, I knew one thing for certain. My revenge was complete. David had taken so much from me, but I had taken back my power. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone take it away again. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I had in months. The weight I had been carrying, of fear, anger, and betrayal, had finally been lifted. David was going to prison for 3 years, and his property and finances were now under court control. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe, and most importantly, I felt free. The weeks that followed were about picking up the pieces of my life. Megan stayed with me for a while, helping me pack up my belongings from the house I had shared with David. Walking through that house was painful. Every room was filled with memories, both good and bad, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Are you sure about moving out, Sandra? Megan asked one day as we carried boxes to the car. I'm sure, I replied firmly. That house isn't home anymore. It's a reminder of everything I went through. I need a fresh start. I found a small, cozy apartment on the other side of Austin, not far from my office. It wasn't big, but it was perfect for me. For the first time, I was living in a space that was completely mine, free of chaos, free of tension, and free of David. The first few days alone were strange. I wasn't used to the quiet, but soon, I began to embrace it. I started filling my apartment with things that brought me joy: soft cushions, potted plants, warm lamps that gave the place a golden glow. I even picked up a new hobby: cooking. It felt good to create something for myself, something that wasn't for anyone else's approval. My job at the financial firm became a lifeline during this time. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects and earning recognition from my boss. For years, I had put everyone else's needs ahead of my own, but now I was rediscovering who I was: a woman who was strong, capable, and independent. One day, I received a letter in the mail. It was the finalization of my divorce from David. Holding that paper in my hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was official. That chapter of my life was closed, and there was no going back. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened. For a while, I had been angry, not just at David, but at myself for letting things get so far. But over time, I realized something important. I wasn't weak for staying as long as I did. I was strong for leaving. I was strong for standing up for myself and seeking justice. David had underestimated me. He thought he could control me, silence me, and break me. But I proved him wrong. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I learned to find joy in the little things, like the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the peace of my apartment, and the satisfaction of knowing that I was finally living for myself. One evening, as I watered the plants on my balcony, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the city. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the warm air, and I smiled. David's betrayal and cruelty had nearly broken me, but I survived. I didn't just survive, I thrived. I reclaimed my strength, my dignity, and my future. This is my story. It's not just about betrayal or revenge. It's about rising up when life tries to knock you down. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. When I shared the exciting news about my scholarship, my stepdad, full of anger, tore my scholarship letter and kicked me out of the house. After 13 years, we met again at the diner, and he threw a glass at me, laughed, and said, "Clean this up, sweeper." Unaware of my position, I called security. He turned pale, and I laughed at him. Then, suddenly, They say life has a way of testing you, and looking back now, I think my test began the day my dad passed away. I was only 14 years old, and everything I knew about stability and love disappeared in an instant. My dad, a school bus driver, was my rock, the one who always encouraged me, who told me I could do anything if I worked hard enough. But that morning, one terrible car accident took him away from me and my mom forever. At first, my mom, Linda, tried to hold it together. She was always a strong woman. She had to be, working as a receptionist and managing our household. But grief changes people. She became quieter, more withdrawn. The bills piled up, and I could see the strain in her eyes. She started working longer hours, taking every extra shift she could find. I knew she was doing her best for us, but we barely spoke anymore. It was like the light in our little house on Park Street in Denver had gone out. About a year later, she came home one evening with an announcement that turned my world upside down. "Scarlett," she said, avoiding my eyes, "I've met someone. His name is Mark." Mark Miller entered our lives like a whirlwind. At first, he seemed nice enough, a polished insurance agent with a confident smile and a firm handshake. He had a son, James, who was 7 at the time, and they moved into our house within a few months of meeting my mom. That's when everything began to change. At first, I tried to adjust. I really did. But it became clear very quickly that I didn't fit into this new family dynamic. My mom, who once used to ask me about my day and listen to my dreams, now spent all her time fussing over James. He was the golden boy, the center of her attention, and I was just there. Mark, on the other hand, made it clear that he didn't care for me. He had this way of making me feel small with just a look or a comment. "Scarlett, how do you not know how to fix a leaky faucet? At your age, you should be more useful around the house," he'd say, shaking his head in disappointment. And then there was his mother, Mrs. Miller, who seemed to live at our house half the time. She was an expert at finding flaws in everything I did, how I sat, how I talked, even how I ate. "Scarlett, don't slouch," she'd snap, pinching my shoulder. "And stop chewing like that. No wonder you're not invited anywhere." It was unbearable. The only escape I had was babysitting for a neighbor, Lisa. She had a little girl named Ava who was 3 years old, with the sweetest giggle you'd ever hear. Ava adored me, and Lisa always treated me like I mattered. "You're so good with her, Scarlett," Lisa would say. "You've got a real knack for this." Babysitting became my safe haven, the one place where I felt appreciated. By the time I turned 16, I was desperate for some independence. I started picking up odd jobs, dog walking, running errands for neighbors, even grocery shopping for an elderly woman down the street. Every dollar I earned went straight into a little tin box I kept under my bed. After months of saving, I finally bought myself a second-hand tablet to help with schoolwork. I'll never forget the day Mark found it. I'd left it charging on the kitchen counter, and when he saw it, his face darkened. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, holding it up like it was contraband. "I bought it," I said, keeping my voice steady. "With my own money." Mark scoffed. "Your money? And you didn't think to ask? That's selfish, Scarlett. James could use this for his homework." Before I could protest, he handed the tablet to James, who grinned like he'd won the lottery. I felt the tears prick my eyes, but I swallowed them down. Crying wouldn't change anything. That night, I told my teacher, Ms. Roberts, what had happened. She listened, her face soft with understanding, and promised to speak to my mom. The next day, my mom returned the tablet to me, but not without a lecture. "You need to stop causing trouble, Scarlett," she said. "Mark's trying his best, and you need to meet him halfway." Trouble. That's what she thought I was. From that moment on, I knew I had to find a way out. I threw myself into my schoolwork, spending late nights studying just to avoid the chaos of the living room. I applied to every scholarship I could find, desperate for a way to escape. And then, one day, the letter arrived. A partial scholarship to a college in Boulder. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. For the first time in years, I felt like I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. I told my family the news at dinner, my voice shaky with excitement. But instead of congratulations, Mark exploded. You made this decision without consulting me? He yelled. You live under my roof, eat my food, and you think you can just do whatever you want? I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. Before I knew it, he had the letter in his hands, tearing it into pieces. You're ungrateful, he said, his voice ice cold. If you think you're so grown up, then go. Get out of my house. My mom just sat there, silent. She didn't defend me. She didn't even look at me. That was the night I packed my things and left, my heart breaking with every step. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. That night, as I left the house with nothing but a small backpack, I felt like I was stepping into the unknown. The streets of Denver were quiet, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. I had no real plan, just a phone with Sophie's number saved in it and a desperate hope that she'd answer. When Sophie picked up, I could barely get the words out through my tears. I can't stay there anymore, I choked. Can I come over? Of course, Sophie said, her voice steady and reassuring. Come here now. We'll figure everything out. By the time I reached Sophie's small apartment, I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. She opened the door and immediately pulled me into a hug. You're safe now, she said, guiding me inside. I told her everything. How Mark tore up my scholarship letter, how my mom didn't defend me, how I felt like I didn't belong in my own family. Sophie listened quietly, her face dark with anger as I spoke. After I finished, she said, You deserve better, Scarlett. You deserve people who support you. And I think I know someone who can help. That's how I met George, Sophie's uncle. George owned a small diner in downtown Denver. It wasn't much to look at, just a little place with chipped red booths and a neon open sign that flickered on and off, but it felt warm and welcoming. When Sophie introduced me to George, I could tell right away that he was different. He had a calm, steady presence, the kind that made you feel like everything would be okay. I heard you're looking for a fresh start, George said, leaning against the counter. I nodded. I'll do anything. I just need a chance. Well, he said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, I could use some extra help around here. You'd start as a server, and there's a little room upstairs you can stay in until you're on your feet. It's not much, but it's clean and quiet. I couldn't believe it. A place to stay and a job, it was more than I could have hoped for. Thank you, I said, my voice shaking. I won't let you down. The first few weeks at the diner were tough. I had never worked in food service before, and I was constantly on my feet, balancing trays of food, refilling coffee cups, and cleaning tables. But George was patient, teaching me the ins and outs of running a diner. He showed me how to take inventory, manage the register, and handle difficult customers. You've got potential, kid, he said one night after closing. You're a hard worker, and that's half the battle in this business. Hearing those words from George meant the world to me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was good at something, like I had a purpose. During the day, I worked at the diner, and at night, I studied. I had contacted the college in Boulder and explained my situation. They allowed me to reapply for the scholarship, and by some miracle, I got it again. With George's support, I managed to juggle my classes and my job, even if it meant sleeping only a few hours a night. Sophie was my rock through it all. She'd stop by the diner after her culinary classes, sharing tips and ideas for recipes. You know, she said one evening as we experimented with new sandwich options, we could really turn this place into something special one day.
It was a crazy thought at the time.
George's diner was small, and we were barely breaking even most months. But the idea planted itself in my mind, a tiny seed of hope for the future. Over the next few years, George became more than just a boss. He became a mentor. He taught me everything he knew about running a business, from negotiating with vendors to creating a menu that people couldn't resist. By the time I graduated college, I was handling the diner's day-to-day operations. George, who was nearing retirement, sat me down one day and said, Scarlett, I've been doing this for 30 years. I think it's time I hand over the reins. What do you think about taking over the place? I was stunned.
Me?
Are you sure? You've earned it, he said with a smile. And I trust you. Sophie and I took over the diner not long after that. It wasn't easy at first. There were so many long nights and tough decisions, but we worked as a team. Together, we transformed George's little diner into something new, something uniquely ours. We modernized the menu, updated the decor, and started hosting community events. Little by little, the diner grew. Word spread about our food and friendly atmosphere, and soon, we had regulars who couldn't get enough of our signature dishes. By the time I turned 29, we had expanded into a chain of diners across Denver. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. I had built something from the ground up, something no one could take away from me. But just when I thought I had left my past behind, life had one more challenge in store for me. Life had finally settled into something that felt like a dream. The diners were thriving. Sophie and I were closer than ever, and I had created a life that I was proud of. I wasn't just surviving, I was living. But life has a way of testing you, even when you think the hardest parts are behind you. My past came crashing back into my life one Friday evening, when I least expected it. It was a typical busy night at the original diner, the one Sophie and I had taken over from George. The tables were full, the kitchen was buzzing, and the scent of burgers and fresh pie filled the air. Sophie was in the back, managing the kitchen staff, while I was making rounds in the dining area, greeting customers, and checking on their meals. That's when I saw them. Sitting at a large table in the corner was my mother, Linda. Next to her sat Mark, looking as smug and arrogant as ever, and beside him, James, now a grown man, laughing with a group of people I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. What were they doing here? I hadn't seen or spoken to them in years, and yet here they were, in my diner of all places. I wanted to walk away, to hide in the kitchen until they left, but something inside me refused to back down. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to their table, keeping my expression neutral. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady. "Welcome to our diner. Is everything to your liking?" Mark's head snapped up, and for a moment, I saw confusion flicker across his face. Then recognition set in, and his smirk returned. Well, he said, leaning back in his chair. "If it isn't little Scarlett. I didn't realize you worked here. What happened? Couldn't make it in the real world." I ignored the jab, keeping my professional demeanor intact. "I'm the owner of this diner," I said calmly. "If there's anything you need, feel free to let me know." Mark's smirk faltered for a split second, but then he laughed, a loud, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. "The owner," he said, shaking his head. "Sure, Scarlett. Whatever helps you sleep at night." I glanced at my mom, hoping for some acknowledgement, some sign that she was proud of what I'd accomplished. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. James, now engaged to the woman sitting beside him, was too busy showing off to his friends to even notice me. I turned to leave, hoping to put as much distance between myself and their table as possible, but Mark wasn't done. "Hey, Scarlett," he called out, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the other diners. "Why don't you grab us some refills? And maybe clean this table while you're at it?" I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'll have one of my staff assist you," I said, and turned away. That's when it happened. I heard the sound of a glass being thrown, and before I could react, water splashed across my back. Mark's laughter echoed behind me. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess I made a mess. Better clean that up, Scarlett. That's all you're good for, isn't it?" The room went silent. Every customer and staff member was watching, waiting to see what I would do. My heart was pounding, my cheeks burning with anger and humiliation. Before I could say anything, Sophie appeared by my side, her expression calm but deadly serious. She turned to Mark and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You should know that Scarlett is the co-owner of this diner, as well as the entire chain. Your behavior is unacceptable, and we have a zero-tolerance policy for abusive customers." Mark's face turned pale. He looked around, realizing for the first time that everyone in the diner was staring at him. His smugness evaporated, replaced by embarrassment. I straightened my shoulders and found my voice. "Staff, please call security," I said, my tone firm. "Mr. Miller and his party are no longer welcome here. Escort them out immediately." The security team, who we kept on call for large events, arrived within minutes. They escorted Mark, Linda, and James out of the diner as the rest of the guests watched in stunned silence. My mother didn't say a word to me. She simply followed Mark out, her head down. The tension in the room eased once they were gone, and one by one, the customers resumed their meals. Sophie placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You handled that like a pro," she said. But I didn't feel like a pro. My hands were still shaking as I went to the back office to compose myself. For years, I had dreamed of confronting Mark, of showing him how far I'd come, but in that moment, all I felt was sadness. The past wasn't as far behind me as I had thought. That night, after Mark and my family were escorted out of the diner, I sat alone in the office. I thought about everything that had just happened, his smug comments, the way he mocked me in front of my customers and staff, and my mom's silence. I thought I had moved past it all, but the truth was, their actions still hurt. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I couldn't let them undo everything I had built. This diner, this life, it was mine, and no one could take it from me. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of notifications on my phone. Apparently, Mark and Linda hadn't wasted any time spinning their version of the story. Mark had posted on social media, calling me ungrateful and claiming that I had ruined James's engagement celebration by kicking them out for no reason. My mom chimed in, writing that I had humiliated the family and that I was bitter and vindictive. At first, I felt anger bubbling up again. But then Sophie knocked on my door, holding her phone.
"You need to see this," she said.
She showed me the security footage from the diner. George had installed a state-of-the-art camera system years ago, and it captured everything that had happened. Mark throwing the glass, his mocking comments, and the moment I calmly asked the staff to escort him out. "I think it's time people saw the truth," Sophie said. I hesitated. Posting the footage would expose everything, the ugly truth about my family and how they treated me. But it would also protect my business and my reputation. After a long moment, I nodded.
"Post it," I said.
Sophie uploaded the video to our diner's social media accounts with a simple caption: "We have a zero-tolerance policy for abusive behavior toward our staff or owners." This is what happened at last night's event. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the video had gone viral. Comments flooded in, with people expressing their support for me and their outrage at Mark's behavior. "I can't believe anyone would act like that in a public place," one person wrote. "This owner handled it so professionally." "Props to her," said another. As the video gained traction, local news outlets picked up the story. Soon, headlines like "Denver Diner Owner Stands Up to Abusive Customer" were everywhere. The attention brought in even more customers, and our diner saw a spike in business. But the fallout for my family was swift. Mark's employer, embarrassed by his behavior, quietly demoted him. James's fiancée's family canceled the engagement party venue they had booked, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. And Mrs. Miller, well, she became an internet meme. A still shot of her shocked face as she was escorted out of the diner spread like wildfire, with captions like, "When you realize you messed with the wrong person." A few days later, I got a phone call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Scarlett," my mom's voice said, soft and pleading. "Can we talk?" "What is there to talk about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "About what happened," she said. "You didn't have to post that video. Mark could lose his job because of this. Do you know what kind of stress you've caused us?" I felt a surge of anger. "What kind of stress I've caused you?" I repeated. "Do you have any idea what you and Mark have put me through? You stood by and watched while he tore me down over and over again, and now you want me to feel guilty?"
"I don't owe you anything, Mom."
"Not anymore." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I just wanted us to be a family." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "We were a family, Mom. Before Mark.
But you chose him over me."
Over and over again. And now, I've built a life without you in it. I hung up before she could say anything else. The social media posts from my family stopped after that, probably because the truth was out there for everyone to see. As the weeks went by, the video faded from the spotlight, but its impact lingered. I pinned it to the top of our diner's page, not as a way to dwell on the past, but as a reminder, to myself and to others, that standing up for yourself is always worth it. As I look back now, I realize that moment in the diner wasn't just about Mark or my family. It was about reclaiming my voice and finally letting go of the pain they caused me. Sometimes, walking away isn't about giving up, it's about protecting yourself. I used to think that success meant proving something to the people who hurt me, but now I know that success is about building a life that makes you proud, no matter what anyone else thinks. Today, the diners are thriving, Sophie and I are planning to expand even further, and I finally feel free. My story isn't one of reconciliation, but it is one of resilience. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I'll never let anyone make me feel small again. When the doctor said I had a second daughter, my husband lost his temper. A second daughter? Are you serious? He shouted. He barged into the labor room and attacked me. The staff quickly stopped him and threw him out. I was shaken but determined. Within a week, I gave him a surprise he never expected. My name is Charlotte Harris, and for a while, I thought my life was a dream come true. I grew up in a small town but moved to Chicago when I was 22 to chase my career in marketing. I worked hard, made my way up the ladder, and by the time I was 32, I had a solid position at a well-known firm. Life seemed perfect when I met Ethan Harris. Ethan was the kind of man who could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. Charming, confident, and intelligent, he swept me off my feet almost instantly. He was a successful real estate agent, and his ambition mirrored my own. We quickly fell in love and got married not long after. At the time, it felt like the start of something beautiful. Our partnership was seamless. Ethan would joke about how we'd be the power couple of Chicago, and I believed every word. Our love story seemed to get better when I found out I was pregnant. I'll never forget the look on Ethan's face when I told him. He lit up, spinning me around the room and talking about all the wonderful things we do as parents. It was a magical moment, and I clung to that hope as my pregnancy progressed. 9 months later, our daughter, Lily, was born. She was perfect, and Ethan doted on her. He was attentive, loving, and always by my side. I thought to myself, this is it. This is the life I've always wanted. A year later, I discovered I was pregnant again, and the joy I felt was overwhelming. I imagined Lily having a sister to grow up with, and I thought of our home filled with laughter and love. But something changed during that second pregnancy. Ethan started working late, constantly. At first, I assumed he was just trying to secure a better future for our growing family, but his behavior became colder, more detached. He stopped asking how I was feeling or showing interest in baby preparations. I told myself he was stressed and tried to be patient. Still, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The turning point came during Emma's birth. I'll never forget the doctor announcing, "It's a girl," and expecting Ethan to smile, to celebrate with me. Instead, his face fell. His words were like a knife to my heart. "Are you sure there's no mistake?" I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but the bitterness in his tone said otherwise. That night, as I held baby Emma in my arms, I cried. Not because I wasn't happy, but because I realized Ethan wasn't the man I thought he was. Things only got worse from there. Ethan grew colder and more irritable. He would snap at the smallest things, often leaving me in tears. He didn't care about the late-night feedings or helping with Lily and Emma. I started feeling like a single parent, even though he was right there in the same house. I still held on to hope that we could fix things, but that hope was shattered one evening after a minor argument over something so trivial I can't even remember what it was. He slapped me hard. My ears rang, and for a moment, I was too stunned to react. Ethan looked as shocked as I felt, but instead of apologizing, he stormed out of the room, leaving me trembling and terrified. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a bad phase. This was something darker, something dangerous. I confided in my best friend, Natalie Brooks. Natalie and I had been close since college, and she was the one person I knew I could trust. I told her everything, Ethan's coldness, his indifference to the kids, and, finally, the slap. Natalie was horrified. She grabbed my hands and said, "Charlotte, you don't have to live like this. You need to get out before it gets worse." She promised to help me, and that promise became the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in months. With Natalie's encouragement, I reached out to a local women's shelter. I was terrified. What if Ethan found out? What if he tried to stop me? But I knew I couldn't stay. Not for me, and certainly not for my daughters. I also contacted a lawyer, Rebecca Carter, who specialized in family law. She listened to my story with compassion and assured me we could build a case to protect me and the girls. I didn't feel strong at that moment, but Rebecca made me believe I could be. As I lay awake at night, holding Emma in one arm and listening to Lily's soft breathing, I made a vow to myself. No matter what it took, I would fight for my daughters. They deserved better. We deserved better. And I was going to make sure we got it, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. The days after that night felt like I was walking on broken glass. Every sound made me flinch. Every moment Ethan was in the house felt like a ticking bomb. I tried to keep things as normal as possible for Lily and Emma, but deep inside, I knew it couldn't go on like this. My daughters deserved a mother who wasn't living in fear. Natalie became my lifeline. She visited often, pretending it was just a friendly drop-by so Ethan wouldn't suspect anything. Behind the scenes, though, she was helping me prepare. She introduced me to Rebecca Carter, the family lawyer who would become my anchor. I remember sitting in Rebecca's office, my hands trembling as I described everything. Ethan's coldness, his temper, and the slap. Rebecca didn't interrupt. She just listened, nodding, and when I finished, she said something that changed everything. "Charlotte, you don't have to do this alone. We'll make sure you and your girls are safe." That same day, I contacted a local women's shelter. The coordinator, a kind woman named Marcy, assured me they could provide temporary housing and support. She explained that the shelter was confidential and secure. Ethan wouldn't be able to find us there. It gave me hope, but it also terrified me. Leaving wasn't just about packing a bag and walking out. It was about uprooting everything I'd known and facing an uncertain future. But I knew it was the only way. I started documenting everything, just like Rebecca advised. Every cold comment, every outburst, every bruise, I captured it all. I even recorded some of our conversations when Ethan's temper flared. I knew it would be crucial if we went to court.
It wasn't easy, though.
Each time Ethan lashed out, I had to act like it didn't hurt, like I wasn't already halfway out the door. One night, Ethan came home unusually early. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and he walked in, looking tense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "About what?" He hesitated, then said, "I think we should take a break. You, me, the girls, maybe we need some time apart. You could stay with your parents for a while." I could barely believe what I was hearing. He was trying to push me out, to make it seem like it was my choice. But I stayed calm. "I'm not leaving my daughters," I said firmly. His face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out again. Instead, he just muttered something under his breath and stormed off. That was the moment I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, while he was at work, I packed a small bag for me and the girls. Natalie drove us to the shelter, and as we pulled away from the house, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. I was finally doing something, but I had no idea what would happen next. The shelter was different from what I expected. It wasn't some cold, institutional place. It was warm, welcoming. The other women there shared similar stories, and for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. Marcy helped me settle in, and I remember her saying, "You're safe now, Charlotte. Take it one day at a time." But safety didn't mean the fight was over. Rebecca and I worked tirelessly on the legal case. We gathered every piece of evidence I had and even reached out to my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who had overheard Ethan yelling during one of his outbursts. She agreed to testify, saying she'd always worried about how Ethan treated me. Ethan, of course, didn't make things easy. He started showing up at the shelter uninvited, demanding to see me and the girls. Marcy and the staff always turned him away, but his persistence was unsettling. He even tried to call me, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and promises to change. One of them still haunts me. "You're ruining our family, Charlotte. Come home, and I'll forgive you." Forgive me? As if I was the one tearing our family apart. Rebecca reassured me that this behavior would only strengthen our case.
He's showing his true colors, she said. But it didn't make it any less terrifying.
The court date finally arrived, and I was a wreck. Walking into that courtroom, seeing Ethan sitting there with his smug expression, it took everything in me not to turn around and run. But then I thought of Lily and Emma, their tiny hands holding mine, their innocent faces looking up at me. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for them. Rebecca was incredible. She presented our case with precision, laying out every detail of Ethan's abuse and neglect. She showed the photos of my bruises, played the recordings, and called Mrs. Jenkins to testify. Ethan's lawyer tried to paint me as overly emotional, but Rebecca didn't let them get away with it. She was relentless, and I was so grateful for her strength. When the judge finally ruled in my favor, granting me full custody of Lily and Emma and ordering Ethan to pay child support, I felt like I could breathe again. Ethan's face when the verdict was read, he looked like someone had knocked the wind out of him. For the first time, I saw him vulnerable, and it was strangely empowering. The battle wasn't over, though. I still had to rebuild my life, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could. As I left the courtroom that day, holding my daughters close, I whispered to them, "We're free now. Mommy's got you." And I meant it. Leaving the courtroom that day felt like the first step into a new life. But stepping out didn't mean I was free from fear. Even with the ruling in my favor, Ethan's shadow loomed over me. He was still out there, still capable of manipulation and cruelty. I couldn't let my guard down, not yet. Back at the shelter, I started piecing things together. The staff there connected me with resources to find housing, and within a few weeks, I managed to secure a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was ours. For the first time in years, I had a space that felt safe, a place where Lily and Emma could just be kids without the tension of Ethan's temper hanging over them. Adjusting to life as a single mother was harder than I expected. There were nights when both girls cried at once, and I felt like I was failing. Bills piled up, and I worried constantly about money. Ethan had been ordered to pay child support, but he wasn't consistent. Some months, the payments came late or not at all. Rebecca assured me we could take legal action if he didn't comply, but even the idea of more court battles exhausted me. Still, I kept going. I found a part-time marketing job that allowed me to work from home, which helped me be there for the girls. Every time I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself why I'd left. I thought of Lily's laughter, Emma's tiny fingers clutching mine, and the quiet moments when I could finally breathe without fear. That kept me moving forward. Natalie stayed by my side through it all. She'd become more than a friend. She was my rock. She dropped by after her shifts at the hospital, bringing groceries or just sitting with me while I vented. One evening, she said something that stuck with me. "You're stronger than you realize, Charlotte. Look at what you've already survived." She was right. I'd survived. But surviving wasn't enough. I wanted to thrive for my daughters and for myself. It was during one of those long nights of reflection that I discovered something shocking. While sorting through old financial documents, I found records of accounts and assets Ethan had never mentioned. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Ethan had been hiding money, lots of it, throughout our marriage. He'd opened accounts under his name and funneled significant amounts of his earnings there, likely to keep me in the dark about his true financial situation. Anger boiled inside me. All those years when he'd made me feel small, when he'd refused to support me emotionally or financially, he'd been sitting on a hidden fortune. I wasn't just angry for myself, I was furious for Lily and Emma. That money could have provided stability for them, and Ethan had kept it hidden out of spite or selfishness. I called Rebecca immediately. She listened carefully, and then said, "We can use this. He's violated the terms of your settlement agreement by hiding assets. It's not just unethical, it's illegal." We started a new legal process to claim what Ethan had tried to hide. It wasn't easy. Ethan, predictably, fought back, accusing me of trying to bleed him dry. But the evidence was irrefutable. With Rebecca's expertise, we were able to uncover the full extent of his deception. When the ruling came down in my favor again, I felt a sense of justice I hadn't thought possible. That money changed everything. It wasn't about revenge. It was about giving my daughters a better future. I set up college funds for both of them and used a portion to pay off debts and create a stable home. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of financial insecurity crushing me. Amid all of this, a surprising friendship began to blossom. Daniel Reed, my neighbor in the apartment complex, had always been kind to me. He was a teacher, and he'd often see me struggling to carry groceries or chasing after the girls. One evening, he knocked on my door with a plate of cookies and said, "I thought you might need a little pick-me-up." It was such a small gesture, but it meant the world to me. Over time, Daniel became a steady presence in our lives. He wasn't pushy or demanding, just kind, patient, and genuinely caring. Lily and Emma adored him, and I found myself looking forward to his visits. For the first time since Ethan, I started to feel the faint stirrings of hope in my heart. But it wasn't just Daniel's kindness that helped me heal, it was the support of everyone around me. Natalie, Rebecca, the women at the shelter, they all reminded me that I wasn't alone. And as I began to rebuild my life, I realized that I wanted to help others who'd been through what I had. I started volunteering at the shelter, sharing my story with women who felt trapped or hopeless. I told them about the fear, the pain, but also about the strength I'd found. Every time I saw a woman's eyes light up with the realization that she could fight back, I felt a little more whole. By then, my life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward, not just surviving. Little did I know, the most shocking twist was still to come. As I began to rebuild my life, I started to feel a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. My daughters were thriving. Lily was adjusting well to kindergarten, making friends and coming home with stories about her day, while Emma, now a toddler, was full of giggles and boundless energy. Every milestone they reached reminded me why I'd fought so hard to escape Ethan's shadow. But the journey wasn't over. One final twist was about to change everything. It started with a routine meeting with Rebecca to finalize some paperwork related to Ethan's hidden assets. As we wrapped up, she mentioned something almost in passing. "Charlotte, there's one last thing we might want to explore. Ethan's financial records suggest he may have ties to some suspicious dealings. It could be worth looking into." At first, I hesitated. I wanted to move on, not dig deeper into Ethan's toxic world. But the thought lingered. What if uncovering more about his secrets could protect me and my daughters in the long run? So, I gave Rebecca the green light to investigate further. What she uncovered left me stunned. Ethan had been involved in fraudulent real estate deals, falsifying documents to inflate property values and pocketing the excess. The accounts he'd hidden weren't just a way to shield money from me. They were part of his larger scheme to avoid detection. Rebecca explained that this wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Ethan could face serious charges if we brought the information to the authorities. For a moment, I grappled with what to do. Part of me wanted to let it go, to focus on the life I was building with my daughters. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of his lies, cruelty, and manipulation, felt a deep sense of responsibility. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting to ensure Ethan couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt me. With Rebecca's help, I submitted the evidence to the authorities. The investigation that followed was intense, and it quickly became clear that Ethan's crimes went deeper than we'd initially thought. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. When I heard the news, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and, most importantly, closure. Ethan's arrest marked the end of his control over my life. For years, he tried to keep me trapped, physically, emotionally, and financially. But now, the tables had turned. He was facing the consequences of his actions, and I was finally free to move forward without fear. With Ethan out of the picture, life began to take on a new rhythm. Daniel became an even more important part of our lives. He never tried to rush me into anything, always respecting the pace I needed to heal. Over time, his quiet kindness melted the walls I'd built around my heart. One evening, as we watched Lily and Emma playing in the park, he turned to me and said, "Charlotte, I don't want to overstep, but I care about you, about all of you. If there's a future where I can be part of your life, I'd be honored." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally. Daniel wasn't trying to control or fix me. He just wanted to be there to support me and my girls as we built our new life. And we did. Together, we created a home filled with love and laughter. But I didn't stop there. My experiences had ignited a fire in me, a desire to help other women escape the cycle of abuse and reclaim their lives. I began speaking at events and sharing my story, hoping to inspire others to find the strength to break free. One of the proudest moments of my life came when I established a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence. With Natalie and Rebecca's help, we created programs to provide shelter, legal aid, and emotional support for women in need. Every time I saw a woman walk through our doors and leave with hope in her eyes, I felt like I was honoring the journey I'd been on. Looking back, I still marvel at how far I've come. There were moments when I thought I'd never escape, when I believed Ethan's cruelty had stolen everything from me. But I've learned that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about finding the strength to rebuild, to thrive, and to turn pain into purpose. Lily and Emma are growing up in a home filled with love, surrounded by people who care for them. They'll never have to know the fear I once felt, and that's the greatest victory of all. My journey wasn't easy, but it's proof that even in the face of betrayal and despair, justice and courage can prevail. And as I sit here today, watching my daughters play in the sunshine, I know one thing for certain. We are free, we are strong, and we are finally home. On my wedding day, when I stopped my stepmom from joining the family photo, she reacted in the most shocking way. She tore my wedding dress in front of all the guests and shouted, "Look at her. Her skin was burned, and she hid it with plastic surgery." Everyone was stunned. My fiancé, influenced by the chaos, canceled the wedding and left the venue. My controlling father remained silent, merely watching the drama unfold. I cried for help, but no one stood by me. My stepmom laughed triumphantly, satisfied that her plan had worked. However, little did she know, I had a secret revenge plan, and by the very next day, she was on her knees. My name is Nancy Carter, and I'd like to tell you a story, my story. It's not one of fairy tales or perfect endings, but one of betrayal, resilience, and finding strength when the world feels like it's falling apart. I grew up with my dad, Robert. He's a kind man, but ever since my mom passed away when I was young, he's struggled to find his footing. A few years after her death, he remarried Sophia, my stepmother. At first, I wanted to give her a chance, to believe she could bring something good into our lives. But Sophia wasn't that kind of woman. She was manipulative, jealous, and petty. My success, my independence, it all seemed to bother her. She would throw snide remarks at me, undermine me whenever she could, and often made my dad feel like I was the problem. Still, I tried to stay strong. I built a career I was proud of as a businesswoman. Every achievement I earned felt like a small victory against the constant negativity Sophia brought into my life. But there was one thing I kept private, something I wasn't ready to share with anyone. I had undergone plastic surgery to remove a few minor skin spots. It was a deeply personal decision, and I didn't want anyone, especially Sophia, to know. I knew how she would twist it, turning something so simple into ammunition against me. My wedding day should have been the happiest day of my life. I was marrying Jake Miller, the man I loved, and I had dreams of starting a new chapter with him. Jake was everything I'd hoped for, kind, supportive, and grounded. His parents, however, were a bit different. They cared a lot about appearances and what other people thought. Still, I was hopeful that love would outweigh everything else. As I was getting ready that morning, Sophia made her way to the bridal suite. She had this smug look on her face, like she was waiting for an opportunity to strike. When it came time for family photos, she insisted on being in one of them. Normally, I might have let it slide, but I was tired of always giving in to her. I said no. I didn't want her toxic energy in what was supposed to be a happy memory. That's when everything spiraled out of control. Sophia's voice cut through the room, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Nancy doesn't want me in the photo because she's hiding something, she said, her tone sharp and accusing. My heart sank as she continued, louder this time. You all should know, her perfect skin isn't real. She had plastic surgery because her skin was burned, and she's been hiding it. The room fell silent, and I felt the weight of every eye on me. My mind raced as I tried to process what she'd just done, but she wasn't finished. She stormed toward me and, before I could react, grabbed the fabric of my wedding dress and yanked it. The sound of the fabric tearing echoed in the room, and I froze as the dress fell apart, exposing the scars from my surgery. Gasps filled the air, and I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. "See?" Sophia shouted, her voice dripping with triumph. She's been hiding this from everyone. I couldn't breathe. The humiliation was suffocating, and I couldn't even look at Jake. My mind screamed for him to defend me, to do something, but he didn't. His parents were the first to react. His mother whispered something to him, and before I knew it, he was walking away with them, leaving me alone in the middle of the chaos. "The wedding is off," Jake's father declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. My world shattered in that moment. I turned to my dad, desperate for support, for him to say something, anything. But he just stood there, his eyes avoiding mine, silent as Sophia smirked in the background. She had planned this, I realized. She wanted this moment, and she had succeeded. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled out of the room. The whispers, the shocked faces, the pitying glances, they all felt like knives stabbing into me. I collapsed in a quiet corner of the venue, my heart breaking into pieces. How could this have happened? How could someone be so cruel? As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Lily, my cousin. She knelt beside me, her eyes filled with empathy and determination. "Nancy, this isn't the end," she said softly. "You don't deserve this. We're going to get through it." Her words sparked something in me, a faint glimmer of resolve. But it wasn't enough to drown out Sophia's laughter in the distance. She had won this battle, but deep down, I knew the war wasn't over. I wiped my tears, the humiliation still raw, but I promised myself one thing in that moment. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Whatever it took, I would make her pay for what she had done. Little did I know, the journey ahead would uncover secrets far darker than I could have imagined. I didn't leave my house for days after the wedding. The humiliation, the betrayal, it all replayed in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sophia tearing my dress, Jake walking away, and the pitiful looks of the guests. It wasn't just the pain of being abandoned at the altar, it was the feeling of being exposed, reduced to nothing by someone who had made it her mission to ruin me. Lily stayed with me through it all. She didn't let me sink completely into despair, even when I wanted to. One evening, as I sat on the couch staring blankly at the wall, she placed a mug of tea in my hands and sat beside me. "Nancy," she said firmly, her voice breaking through the fog of my thoughts. "You can't let her win. She's been trying to tear you down for years, and this, what she did at the wedding, this was her ultimate move. If you give up now, she gets everything she wanted." I looked at her, my voice barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to do, Lily? She destroyed my life. Jake is gone. His parents hate me. Everyone at that wedding saw everything. How do I come back from that?" She leaned in, her eyes full of determination. "You fight back. Sophia's not some invincible force. She's just a bitter, cruel woman. And I bet if we dig deep enough, we'll find out that she's hiding something too. You're not the only one with secrets." Her words planted a seed in my mind. Sophia had always been calculated, always a step ahead. But what if I could turn the tables? What if I could expose her for who she really was? That night, I made the decision. I wasn't going to let Sophia's cruelty define my life. I contacted a private investigator, Ryan Blake, the next day. I told him everything, how Sophia had tormented me for years, how she had humiliated me at my wedding, and how I needed to know the truth about her. Ryan listened carefully, his expression serious. "I'll look into it," he said, his voice steady. "People like her often have skeletons in their closet. It's just a matter of finding them." The next few weeks felt like an eternity. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart raced, hoping it was Ryan with news. In the meantime, I tried to pick up the pieces of my life. My dad, still under Sophia's thumb, avoided me. Jake didn't call, and I didn't have the courage to reach out to him. Then one evening, Ryan called. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "Nancy, I think you're going to want to hear this in person," he said. "Can you meet me tomorrow?" The next day, I sat across from Ryan in his small office, my hands trembling slightly as I waited for him to speak. He placed a folder on the desk between us and slid it toward me. "Sophia has been involved in illegal activities," he began. "Specifically, she's been selling harmful drugs through an underground network. It's not just a minor operation. These drugs have caused significant harm to people. And she's been doing it for years." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. "Illegal drugs?" I repeated, my voice shaking. He nodded.
"She's clever about it.
"Most of her dealings are done through intermediaries, but I've gathered enough evidence to connect her directly to the operation. Bank records, phone logs, even testimonies from people who've dealt with her. It's all in that folder." I opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. Each piece of evidence felt like a puzzle piece falling into place, revealing a picture of a woman far more dangerous than I had imagined. "Does my dad know about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan shook his head. "From what I can tell, he's completely in the dark. She's been careful to keep her business separate from him." The anger that had been simmering inside me since the wedding began to boil over. This wasn't just about what Sophia had done to me. This was about what she had done to countless others, the lies she had built her life on, and the people she had hurt along the way. "I want to take her down," I said, my voice steady with determination. "I want to make sure she pays for everything she's done." Ryan nodded. "With this evidence, you have a strong case. You'll need a good lawyer, though. Someone who can handle something this big." I contacted Sarah Davis, a lawyer known for her no-nonsense attitude and sharp legal mind. When I explained the situation, she agreed to help without hesitation. "People like Sophia thrive because no one stands up to them," Sarah said during our first meeting. "But we're going to change that. She's not going to get away with this." The next steps were daunting. Filing a case, preparing for the inevitable backlash. It felt like I was gearing up for war. But for the first time since the wedding, I felt a spark of hope. Sophia had spent years trying to break me, but now I had the power to fight back. As I left Sarah's office that day, I couldn't help but smile. Sophia had no idea what was coming, but soon, the truth would catch up with her. And this time, I wasn't going to back down. As the case against Sophia began to take shape, I could feel the tension building. Every step felt like a mix of progress and dread, but I knew there was no turning back. Sarah was relentless in her work, and Ryan continued to uncover more about Sophia's hidden dealings. What started as a tangled web of deceit was now becoming clear and undeniable. My first challenge was telling my father. Despite everything, he was still my dad, and I didn't want him blindsided when the truth came out. One evening, I invited him over to my apartment. He looked uneasy, avoiding eye contact, and I could tell Sophia had already started spinning her narrative. "Nancy," he began, his voice hesitant, "Sophia said you're trying to cause trouble for the family. I know things have been difficult, but..." I cut him off. "Dad, stop. I need you to listen to me. This isn't about family drama. It's about the truth." I slid the folder Ryan had prepared across the table to him. "You need to see this." As he flipped through the pages, his face paled. His hands shook slightly as he read through the evidence of Sophia's involvement in the illegal drug trade. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were filled with disbelief. This can't be true," he whispered. "She wouldn't." "She would," I said firmly. "And she has. For years, Dad. She's been lying to you, to everyone. She's not the person you think she is. He sat back in his chair, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the truth settled on him. I didn't see it, he murmured. All this time, I thought. His voice trailed off. I need you to stand with me, I said, leaning forward. This isn't just about what she's done to me. It's about everything she's done to hurt people, to destroy lives. We can't let her get away with this. He nodded slowly, the fight draining from his expression. You're right. I've let her control me for too long.
I'll support you, Nancy.
Whatever you need. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of connection with my dad. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a start. The court date came faster than I expected. Walking into that courthouse felt like stepping into a battlefield. Sophia was there, of course, with her sharp suit and an expression that oozed confidence. But I noticed something different. There was a crack in her facade, a flicker of unease in her eyes. She knew the walls were closing in. Sarah was brilliant in the courtroom, presenting the evidence with precision and clarity. Ryan's findings were ironclad, and the testimonies from people Sophia had hurt painted a damning picture. As the days went on, Sophia's confidence began to waver. Her lawyer scrambled to counter the evidence, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. When the verdict was finally announced, the room was silent. The judge's words were firm and final. Sophia was guilty on all counts. She would face prison time for her crimes. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was over. She was finally going to pay for everything she had done. But the moment wasn't just about her. It was about me reclaiming my life. As Sophia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned to me, her eyes filled with fury. You think you've won? She hissed. This isn't over. I didn't flinch. It is for you, I said calmly. For the first time, I felt free from her shadow. After the trial, my dad came to me, his face lined with regret. Nancy, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I should have seen what she was doing. I should have stood up for you sooner. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes.
Thank you, Dad.
That means more than, you know. The aftermath of the trial brought a whirlwind of emotions. I heard whispers of Sophia's business associates facing similar investigations, and I knew the ripple effect of her actions was only beginning. My dad filed for divorce, cutting ties with her completely. He was trying to rebuild his life, and so was I. But the most unexpected moment came a few weeks later when Jake and his parents showed up at my door. My first instinct was to slam it in their faces, but something in Jake's eyes stopped me. He looked ashamed, broken in a way I hadn't seen before. Nancy, he began, his voice trembling, I was wrong. We were all wrong. I let my parents' judgment cloud my own, and I let Sophia manipulate me. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. His parents echoed his apology, admitting their mistake in believing Sophia's lies. For a long moment, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to scream, to tell them they didn't deserve a second chance. But deep down, I knew forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about me. I need time, I said finally. If you're serious about making things right, it's going to take more than words. Jake nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I'll do whatever it takes. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the beginning of something new. My life was finally moving forward, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. As I sat in my apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized just how much my life had changed. In a matter of months, I had gone from a woman humiliated and broken on her wedding day to someone who had stood up against a lifetime of manipulation and cruelty. But my journey wasn't over yet. After Sophia's conviction and my father's decision to divorce her, there was a sense of closure. The weight of her toxic influence had been lifted, not just from my life but from my father's as well. For the first time in years, I saw him as the man he used to be, kind, thoughtful, and determined to make things right. He visited me often, bringing me flowers or cooking meals as a way to apologize for the years he had stood by silently while Sophia tore me down. One evening, over dinner, he looked at me and said, Nancy, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about standing up for what's right. I want you to know I'm proud of you. You've shown more courage than I ever did, and I'll never stop trying to make up for the past." His words brought tears to my eyes.
"Thank you, Dad," I said softly.
That means everything to me. Meanwhile, Jake had been working hard to prove he deserved a second chance. He wrote me letters, apologizing again and again for abandoning me when I needed him most. He showed up at my workplace with small, thoughtful gifts, nothing extravagant, just reminders that he was thinking of me. And his parents, once so cold and judgmental, were doing their best to rebuild the bridge they had burned. But forgiveness wasn't easy. Every time I saw Jake, I remembered the pain of that day, the way he had walked away without even trying to defend me. It wasn't something I could forget overnight. Still, I could see that he was genuine in his efforts. He wasn't the same man who had left me standing alone in that wedding hall. One day, he asked to meet me at the park where we used to go when we were dating. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready for what he might say. But something in me told me to go. When I arrived, he was already there, holding a small bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers. He smiled nervously as I approached. "Nancy," he began, "I know I've said this 100 times, but I need you to hear it again.
I'm so sorry.
I let you down in the worst way possible, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me." I looked at him, my heart heavy with emotions I couldn't quite untangle. "Jake," I said slowly, "what happened at the wedding? It broke something in me. It made me question everything, including us. But I can see how hard you've been trying, and I can see that you mean it. If we're going to move forward, it has to be on new terms. No more doubts, no more letting other people influence our lives. It has to be about us, and only us." His eyes lit up with hope. "Absolutely," he said, taking my hands in his. "It's just us from now on. I promise." For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Maybe we could rebuild what we had lost. Maybe there was a future for us after all. Months later, we had a small, intimate wedding. It wasn't the grand affair we had originally planned, but it was perfect in its simplicity. Surrounded by close friends and family, including my dad, who beamed with pride, I said "I do" to the man who had fought to win back my trust. As I looked into Jake's eyes, I knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, one built on honesty and resilience. Sophia's shadow no longer loomed over my life. She was serving her sentence, and her name was rarely mentioned in our family anymore. My father continued to rebuild his life, and our relationship grew stronger every day. And Lily, my steadfast, loyal cousin, remained my rock, reminding me of the strength I had found within myself. In the end, I realized that the scars Sophia had exposed on my wedding day weren't something to be ashamed of. They were a part of my story, a testament to everything I had overcome. They were proof that I could rise from the ashes, stronger and more determined than ever. As I stood in my new home with Jake, looking out at the city skyline, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. My journey hadn't been easy, and there were moments when I thought I'd never recover from the pain. But I had survived. I had fought back. And I had reclaimed my life. Sometimes I think back to that moment at the wedding when Sophia tore my dress and exposed my scars. What she thought would be my downfall turned out to be my greatest source of strength. She showed the world my vulnerabilities, but she also gave me the courage to stand tall and fight for what I deserved. This is my story, a story of betrayal and revenge, but also of resilience, justice, and finding love again. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. No matter how dark things seem, there's always a way to rise again. You just have to believe in your own strength. On our honeymoon trip, my greedy husband stopped the car at a hilly area and ordered me to sign papers transferring my $120 million inheritance to him. In anger, I tore up the papers. Furious, he pushed me off the hilltop cliff. As I fell, he laughed and said, "Your chapter is over." Luckily, I survived and returned with a revenge plan he never saw coming. Hi, I'm Chloe, and this is the story of how my life went from a dream to a nightmare and how I found the strength to fight back. To understand everything, We have to go back to when my father passed away. My dad, Richard, was an incredible man, kind, hardworking, and the reason I had the life I did. He built his business empire from scratch, and when he died unexpectedly at 58, I was devastated. I was his only child, and the inheritance he left me, $120 million, was both a blessing and a heavy burden. At 25, I wasn't prepared for that kind of responsibility. My husband, Ethan, who I married 2 years ago, was there to support me, or so I thought. Ethan was charming when we met, with a smile that could light up a room. But looking back, I realize how carefully he played his part. He was unemployed when we got married, but I believed his promises to find his path. Little did I know his path involved using me. Ethan's mother, Margaret, was another story entirely. From the moment we met, she made it clear she didn't think I was good enough for her son. She was in her 50s but carried herself like royalty, always looking down her nose at me. She'd make snide comments about how I didn't cook like a proper wife or didn't dress like someone worthy of being in their family. For Ethan's sake, I tried to keep the peace. But things changed after my father's death. After the funeral, I started noticing things. Ethan and Margaret began spending a lot of time together, whispering in corners and cutting me out of conversations. They claimed they were worried about me and just discussing family matters, but their words didn't match their actions. Ethan started pressuring me to transfer parts of my inheritance into joint accounts, saying it would be easier to manage. Margaret kept hinting that the money was too much responsibility for someone my age, insisting I should let Ethan handle it. I told them both no, but their persistence didn't stop. Then came the trip, the one that changed everything. Ethan suggested we take a short vacation to a beautiful hilly area a few hours away. He said it would be good for me to get away and clear my head. Margaret insisted on coming along, saying it would be a nice, family bonding experience. Against my better judgment, I agreed. At that point, I was desperate to believe Ethan still cared about me. The day of the trip was unusually tense. Ethan and Margaret seemed excited, almost too much so. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We drove up winding roads, the scenery turning more beautiful, but eerily desolate. There were no other cars, no towns, just endless cliffs and rocky terrain. Then it happened. Ethan stopped the car at a secluded spot, claiming we needed to take in the view. I hesitated but got out with them. Margaret stood by the car, and Ethan walked me to the edge of the cliff. That's when he pulled out a stack of papers. "Chloe," he said, his voice sickeningly sweet, "we need you to sign these documents. It's for the inheritance. It'll make things easier for everyone." I looked at the papers and froze. They weren't just documents. They were papers to transfer every penny of my inheritance to Ethan and Margaret. My heart raced as I looked up at them. "I'm not signing this," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. That's when their masks fell. Margaret sneered, stepping closer. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Chloe. You're too naive to handle that kind of money anyway. Just sign it." When I still refused, Ethan's face darkened. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and unrecognizable. "You don't get it, do you? You either sign these papers, or you won't have to worry about the money at all." I felt panic rising in my chest. "What are you saying? You can't be serious." Margaret laughed, a cold, cruel sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, she's serious. And if you don't sign, we'll make sure you don't have to worry about anything ever again." Before I could react, Ethan shoved me hard. The world blurred as I fell backward, tumbling down the rocky cliff. I hit the ground hard, pain exploding in every part of my body. Then, everything went dark. When I came to, the first thing I heard was laughter. Margaret and Ethan, standing above me, their figures blurred against the sky. "That's that," Margaret said. "We're $120 million richer now." "And Chloe's?" Ethan asked, smirking. "She's a chapter that's closed," Margaret replied. They left. I lay there, broken and barely breathing, their laughter echoing in my ears. But they were wrong. My story wasn't over. It was just beginning. When I woke up again, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. My body screamed in pain, and for a moment I thought I might not survive. But then I realized I was still alive. Against all odds, I had survived the fall. I couldn't move much, but I could hear voices in the distance. A group of hikers was passing through the area, their laughter and chatter carried on the wind. I used the last bit of strength I had to call out. My voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but somehow they heard me. A young woman rushed over, followed by a few others. Their faces were filled with shock and concern as they realized what had happened. I couldn't explain much then. I just told them I fell and begged them to help me. The hikers called for help, and I was rushed to a nearby hospital. The doctors said it was a miracle I was alive. I had a broken arm, fractured ribs, and cuts all over my body, but nothing that couldn't heal with time. As I lay in the hospital bed, everything came flooding back. Ethan's smirk, Margaret's laughter, the papers they tried to force me to sign. Anger burned through me like a fire. They thought I was dead. They thought they had won. But they underestimated me. The first step in my plan was to stay hidden. I didn't want Ethan or Margaret to know I had survived. If they found out, they'd do whatever it took to finish what they started. I used the little money I had in a personal account to cover my hospital bills and found a quiet place to recover. I avoided the news, but I couldn't stop wondering what they were doing. Were they celebrating? Spending my inheritance already? The thought made my blood boil. Once I was strong enough to move around, I reached out to Daniel, a lawyer I'd met years ago through my father. He was one of the few people I trusted. When I told him what had happened, he was horrified. "Chloe," he said, "this isn't just about the money. They tried to kill you. You need justice." Daniel agreed to help me, but he warned me it wouldn't be easy. Ethan and Margaret had the money and resources now, and they could cover their tracks if we weren't careful. "We'll need solid evidence," he said. "Something that proves what they did." Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I worked tirelessly to build a case. He dug into financial records, looking for signs of fraud or suspicious activity. I spent hours recalling every detail of that day, every word Ethan and Margaret said. We even reached out to the hikers who found me, hoping their testimony could help. Then we got our first breakthrough. Daniel discovered that Ethan had been in contact with a shady financial advisor just days before the trip. It looked like they had been planning to move the inheritance into offshore accounts, money they didn't legally own. This was the kind of evidence we needed to prove their intentions weren't just greedy but criminal. But we needed more. That's when I remembered something, a tiny detail that seemed insignificant at the time. Margaret had been filming parts of the trip on her phone. I didn't think much of it before, but now I realized those videos might include the moments leading up to the cliff incident. If we could get our hands on that phone, it could be the key to everything. Stealing Margaret's phone was risky, but I had no choice. Asked Daniel if he knew a private investigator who could help. He introduced me to Lila, a resourceful woman with a knack for uncovering secrets. Lila managed to get close to Margaret by pretending to be interested in joining one of her social clubs. Within days, she had access to Margaret's phone. What Lila found was devastating, and exactly what we needed. Margaret had recorded part of their conversation at the cliff. The video didn't show them pushing me, but it captured Ethan's voice saying, "She'll either sign it, or she won't live to see another day." Margaret's laugh followed, cold and mocking. It was undeniable proof of their intent to harm me. When Daniel saw the video, he said, "This is it, Chloe. This is what will bring them down." The next step was to file a lawsuit. Daniel advised that we keep my survival a secret for as long as possible to catch Ethan and Margaret off guard. They were living comfortably, thinking they had gotten away with their crime. Margaret had even thrown a lavish party to celebrate their new life. The audacity made me sick. Finally, the day came to serve them with legal papers. Ethan's face when he saw my name on the documents must have been priceless. According to Daniel, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Margaret, on the other hand, tried to act calm, but we both knew her composure wouldn't last. I stayed in hiding as the case moved forward, letting Daniel and the legal team handle most of the work. The media picked up the story, and it quickly became a sensation. "Millionaire heiress betrayed by husband and mother-in-law," the headlines read. The public was outraged by their greed and cruelty, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. But I wasn't naive. I knew Ethan and Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight. They had lawyers of their own, and I could only imagine the lies they were spinning to protect themselves. Still, I had something they didn't: the truth. The day the trial began, I was finally ready to step out of hiding. It had been months since I'd last seen Ethan and Margaret, and walking into the courtroom knowing I would face them again sent a chill through me. But I wasn't that same vulnerable girl they'd tried to kill. I was stronger now, fueled by determination and the need for justice. Ethan and Margaret were already seated at the defendant's table when I entered. The moment Ethan saw me, his face turned pale. He whispered something to Margaret, who glanced my way with wide eyes. I could almost hear the thoughts racing through their minds. She's alive. It was satisfying to see their fear, but I kept my expression calm. I didn't want them to see how much this moment affected me. The prosecution, led by my lawyer Daniel, laid out the case methodically. First, he presented financial records showing Ethan and Margaret's suspicious activities. Offshore accounts, forged signatures, and falsified documents all painted a picture of greed and premeditation. The judge listened intently as Daniel explained how they planned to take my inheritance for themselves. Next came the hikers who had found me. They testified about discovering me at the bottom of the cliff, injured but alive. One of them described the remote location, emphasizing how unlikely it was that my fall had been an accident. Their words helped establish the timeline and made it clear that I couldn't have survived without their help. But the turning point came when Daniel introduced the video footage Lila had recovered from Margaret's phone. As it played in the courtroom, Ethan's voice echoed through the room. "She'll either sign it, or she won't live to see another day." Margaret's laughter followed, chilling and unmistakable. The air in the courtroom grew heavy as everyone processed the implication. There was no denying their intent now. Ethan's lawyer tried to argue that the video was taken out of context, claiming it was a joke. But the tone of his voice and the sinister laugh that followed made that explanation fall flat. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed uncharacteristically quiet. I could tell she was trying to figure out how to spin the situation in her favor, but the evidence was overwhelming. When it was my turn to testify, I told the court everything: how they had pressured me to sign over my inheritance, how they laughed as they pushed me off the cliff, and how I'd fought to survive against all odds. My voice trembled at times, but I held my head high. This was my story, and I wasn't going to let them silence me again. Ethan avoided my gaze the entire time, but Margaret stared at me with a mix of anger and desperation. It was clear she thought she could intimidate me, but I didn't flinch. She no longer had any power over me. The defense tried to paint me as someone who was lying for attention, claiming I had fabricated the entire story to tarnish their reputations. But Daniel was ready for every argument they threw at us. He presented witness testimony, medical records from my injuries, and even bank statements showing how they had already begun spending my inheritance. Piece by piece, he dismantled their defense until there was nothing left. As the trial progressed, the media swarmed the courthouse. Headlines screamed about the shocking betrayal and attempted murder. Public opinion was firmly on my side, and I started receiving messages of support from strangers who were outraged by Ethan and Margaret's actions. It gave me strength, knowing so many people believed in my fight for justice. One of the most dramatic moments came when the prosecution revealed a key piece of evidence, a confession from the financial advisor Ethan had worked with. Under pressure, he admitted that Ethan and Margaret had hired him to move the inheritance into hidden accounts, explicitly stating that Chloe would no longer be an issue after the trip. It was the nail in the coffin. Ethan, faced with mounting evidence, finally cracked under pressure. During cross-examination, he broke down and tried to shift all the blame onto Margaret. "It was her idea," he shouted, pointing at his mother. "She planned everything. I just did what she told me to do." Margaret's composure shattered at that moment. "Don't you dare put this on me," she snapped, her voice filled with venom. "You're the one who pushed her off that cliff." Their arguments played out in front of the entire courtroom, leaving no doubt about their guilt. It was a spectacle I would never forget, and for the first time, I felt a sense of relief. Justice was within reach. After weeks of testimonies, evidence, and legal battles, the jury reached a verdict. Ethan and Margaret were found guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. When the judge handed down their sentences, I felt a wave of emotion I couldn't quite describe: relief, vindication, and a sense of closure all at once. Ethan received 25 years in prison, while Margaret was sentenced to 30 years due to her role as the mastermind behind the plot. As they were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I watched them go with no regret. They had taken so much from me, my trust, my peace of mind, but they hadn't broken me. I had survived, and I had won. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The inheritance was legally returned to me, but more importantly, I was free from the toxic hold Ethan and Margaret had on my life. The battle wasn't easy, but it taught me something invaluable. I was stronger than I ever imagined. But my story wasn't over yet. Even though justice had been served, I still had to rebuild my life and figure out what came next. For now, though, I was content to take it one step at a time. After the trial, I thought I'd feel an immediate sense of peace, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. And in many ways, I did. Ethan and Margaret were no longer threats to my life, and I had reclaimed my inheritance. But the journey wasn't over. The emotional scars they left behind were just as real as the physical ones I'd sustained in the fall. The first thing I did after the verdict was visit my father's grave. I hadn't been able to bring myself to go before, too consumed by the chaos Ethan and Margaret had created. Standing there, I let all the emotions I'd been holding back pour out: grief, anger, relief, and a deep sadness for everything I'd lost. "I did it, Dad," I whispered. "They didn't win. I hope you're proud." Returning to my home in Portland was both comforting and strange. The house felt different, quieter, but not in a bad way. It was a reminder that this space was mine now, free from the toxic energy of Ethan and Margaret. I hired a security team to ensure my safety, installed state-of-the-art surveillance, and changed all the locks. I wasn't going to let my guard down again. One of the most challenging parts of moving forward was deciding what to do with the inheritance. For so long, it had been a source of pain and conflict, but now it was an opportunity, a second chance. I worked closely with Daniel, who became more than just my lawyer. He was a trusted friend. Together, we created a plan to invest part of the inheritance into causes that mattered to me. I started a foundation in my father's name to support young entrepreneurs, just as he had once been. Despite these positive steps, I couldn't escape the memories of what happened. I often replayed that day on the cliff in my mind, wondering if there were signs I had missed, moments when I could have prevented it all. It was exhausting, but therapy helped. My therapist reminded me that I wasn't to blame for their greed or cruelty. "You're a survivor, Chloe," she said. "What they did says everything about them and nothing about you." Through therapy, I began to rediscover who I was outside of the nightmare Ethan and Margaret had created. I reconnected with old friends, people I had distanced myself from during my marriage. They welcomed me back with open arms, and their support reminded me that not everyone in my life wanted something from me. One day, I received an unexpected letter from Margaret. She had written it from prison, begging for forgiveness and blaming Ethan for pushing her into it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I'd spent enough time entangled in their lies and manipulation, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she still had any power over me. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would be for my own peace, not for her. Ethan, on the other hand, remained silent. I later learned through Daniel that he was struggling in prison, abandoned by the very people he had tried to impress with my money. Part of me felt sorry for him, but the larger part knew he was reaping the consequences of his actions. They both were. Now, as I look back on everything, I see it as a lesson, a painful, life-altering lesson, but one that made me stronger. I learned to trust my instincts, to recognize red flags, and to value the people in my life who truly cared for me. Most importantly, I learned that I was capable of surviving even the darkest moments. Today, I'm not the same Chloe who stood on that cliff, terrified and betrayed. I'm someone who fought back, someone who reclaimed her life and built something new out of the ashes. The past will always be a part of me, but it doesn't define me. As I close this chapter, I feel a sense of freedom I never thought I'd have again. My story is one of betrayal and revenge, but it's also one of resilience and triumph. For the first time in a long time, I feel like the future is mine to shape. And I'm ready. When I begged my husband for money to save our 3-year-old daughter's life, he looked me in the eye and said, "I don't have room for sick people in my life." Then, he threw us out onto the streets and brought in his new mistress. I stood there crying, clutching my daughter, as he slammed the door in our faces. What he didn't know was that his betrayal sparked something inside me, a plan for revenge. And by the next morning, when he woke up, his perfect world had already started to crumble. My name is Dorothy, and if you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you I was living the dream. At 29, I was married to Adam, a man I thought was my soulmate, and we lived in a beautiful home in Houston, Texas. Our daughter, Sophia, had just turned 3, and she was the light of my life. Everything seemed perfect, or, at least, I convinced myself it was. Adam was a businessman, always busy, but always providing. He was 33, charming, and ambitious. I was a homemaker, proud of the family we were building. When Sophia came into our lives, it felt like the missing piece to our puzzle. I spent my days planning her meals, playing with her, and dreaming of the life she would have. Adam worked long hours, but I told myself it was all for us. I never questioned his late nights or sudden business trips. I trusted him, and I believed in our life together. Sophia was my world. At 3, she was full of curiosity and laughter. Her giggles filled the house like music, and her little hands always reached for mine. She was the reason I smiled every day. Adam adored her too, or so I thought. He would lift her high in the air, calling her his princess. Those moments felt real, and I clung to them, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. One evening, after Sophia's 3rd birthday, Adam told me he had a big business trip coming up. He kissed me on the forehead and said he'd be away for a few days. It wasn't unusual. His work often took him out of town. I didn't mind. I trusted him completely, and I believed his work was what kept our family secure. Things took a turn for the worse a few days later. It started with Sophia catching a cold. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids get sick, right? But her fever rose quickly, and by the 2nd day, she was burning up and barely able to keep her eyes open. I tried everything. Cool compresses, over-the-counter medicine, but nothing worked. Her little body felt so fragile in my arms, and her soft whimpers broke my heart. I was terrified. I called Adam immediately, hoping he'd rush home to help. When he picked up, I could barely speak through my panic. "Adam, Sophia's really sick. She has a high fever, and I don't know what to do." His response still haunts me. "I'm about to board a plane, Dorothy. You'll have to handle it. She's probably fine. Just give her some medicine." "Adam, it's serious," I pleaded. "She needs a doctor." "Dorothy," he said, his tone colder than I'd ever heard it, "I'm not canceling a business trip over a little fever. You're her mother. Handle it." He hung up, leaving me stunned and holding a child who desperately needed help. For a moment, I couldn't move. How could the man I had loved and trusted be so dismissive? But Sophia didn't have time for me to process my shock. She needed me to act. I rushed her to the hospital, praying the entire way. The emergency room was chaos, but I begged the receptionist to help. When Dr. Wilson, a neurologist, finally examined her, his face grew serious. He explained that the fever had caused complications in her brain. "She needs surgery immediately," he said. "It's the only way to save her." My heart dropped. "Surgery? My sweet, tiny Sophia? How much will it cost?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dr. Wilson hesitated. "You'll need to pay a $15,000 deposit for us to proceed." $15,000. I didn't have that kind of money, and Adam wasn't answering my calls. I texted him, left voicemails, even sent voice messages. He saw them, I know, because the messages marked as read, but he didn't reply. My husband, The man who claimed to love our family was ignoring us in our darkest hour. I sat in that cold hospital corridor, holding Sophia's limp hand and crying like I'd never cried before. I didn't know what to do. Then it hit me. I had no choice. I ran home, grabbed my jewelry box, and returned to the hospital. I sold every piece I had. My wedding ring, family heirlooms, everything. It still wasn't enough, but I begged the jeweler to advance me the rest. By some miracle, he agreed. I handed over the deposit, and Dr. Wilson and his team moved quickly. Hours felt like years as I sat in the waiting room, praying for Sophia's life. When Dr. Wilson finally came out, he gave me a small, reassuring smile. The surgery was successful. She's going to be okay. Relief washed over me, and I fell to my knees, thanking him and the team for saving my daughter. Sophia was alive, and that was all that mattered. But even in that moment of gratitude, questions gnawed at me. Where was Adam? Why hadn't he cared enough to respond? My heart began to crack, and though I didn't know it then, it was the beginning of the end. My perfect life was shattering, piece by piece. I had no idea what awaited me when we returned home. When Sophia and I finally returned home from the hospital, I was emotionally and physically drained. All I wanted was to put her to bed and rest after the nightmare of the past few days. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something strange. Adam's car was parked in the driveway. My heart lifted for a brief moment. Maybe he was here to explain, to apologize. Maybe I'd misunderstood his silence during Sophia's crisis. Carrying Sophia in my arms, I approached the door. I could see the lights on inside and hear muffled voices. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I opened the door, and what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Adam was standing in the living room with a young woman I'd never seen before. She was tall, with perfect hair and a smug smile that made my stomach turn. They were laughing, standing far too close for it to be innocent. Sophia whimpered in my arms, sensing my tension. "Adam," I said, my voice trembling. "Who is this?" He turned to me, his expression calm, almost indifferent. "This is Chloe," he said, as if introducing an old friend. "We're together now." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. Together? What was he talking about? "Adam," I said, my voice rising. "What do you mean?" "I just came back from the hospital with our daughter. Do you even care what she's been through?" "What I've been through?" His response was a dagger to my heart. "Dorothy," he said coldly, "I've made my decision. You and Sophia can manage on your own from now on. I don't need sick people dragging me down." I stared at him in disbelief. Was this really the man I'd built a life with? The father of my child? The room seemed to spin as his words sank in. "You're leaving us?" I whispered. "For hers?" Chloe stepped forward, her smile widening. "It's not personal," she said in a sickly sweet tone. "Adam and I have something you don't understand." I couldn't hold back anymore. "How dare you?" I shouted, my anger finally breaking through my shock. "I've been holding this family together while you've been off playing with your little girlfriend. Do you even know what I had to do to save our daughter's life? I sold everything. My wedding ring, my mother's necklace. All because you didn't care enough to answer your phone." Adam shrugged, his face expressionless. "That's your problem, Dorothy. Not mine." Before I could say another word, he walked to the door and opened it. "You need to leave," he said firmly. "I've already packed your things. They're outside." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're kicking us out?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Where are we supposed to go, Adam?" "This is Sophia's home." "It's my house," he said with finality. "You'll figure it out." Chloe leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "Good luck, Dorothy," she said with mock sympathy. I felt the weight of Sophia in my arms, her little body warm against mine, and that gave me the strength to hold my head high. "You'll regret this, Adam," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "You're a coward and a liar, and I'll make sure the world knows it." He didn't flinch. "Do what you need to do," he said dismissively, shutting the door behind me. Standing outside in the cold night, I felt a mix of fury and despair. I looked at Sophia, her innocent face so unaware of the betrayal we'd just experienced. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, more for myself than for her. "We'll get through this. I promise." With nowhere else to turn, I called Grace, my best friend. She answered on the first ring, her voice filled with concern. "Dorothy? What's wrong?" I told her everything in a rush: the hospital, the surgery, Adam's betrayal, and how he'd thrown us out. Grace didn't hesitate. "Come to me," she said firmly. "I'll meet you at the shelter. You're not alone in this." When I arrived at the women's shelter where Grace worked, she wrapped me in a tight hug. "You're safe now," she said softly. "We'll figure this out together." Over the next few days, I poured my heart out to Grace. I told her about Adam's sudden coldness, his betrayal, and the way he had chosen Chloe over his own family. She listened without judgment, her face a mix of anger and sadness. "Dorothy," she said one evening, "I think there's more to this. Adam doesn't just walk away from his family without a reason. Something doesn't add up." "What do you mean?" I asked, though deep down, I suspected she was right. Grace leaned forward, her expression serious. "I think Adam's hiding something. And I know someone who can help us find out." That's how I met Ethan, a private investigator Grace trusted. He was in his early 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. "I'll dig into Adam's life," he said. "If there's anything to uncover, I'll find it." I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew one thing. I needed answers. Adam had shattered my life, and I couldn't let him get away with it. As I waited for Ethan's findings, I focused on Sophia, who was slowly recovering. Her laughter was quieter now, her energy diminished, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Still, I couldn't shake the anger that burned in my chest. Adam had betrayed us, abandoned us, and I wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. Whatever secrets he was hiding, I was determined to uncover them. I didn't know it yet, but the truth would change everything. A week after meeting Ethan, I sat in Grace's small office at the shelter, anxiously waiting for him to arrive with his findings. My mind was racing with questions. What could Adam possibly be hiding? Was this betrayal just the tip of the iceberg? Sophia was playing quietly in the corner, her soft giggles a small comfort amid the turmoil. When Ethan finally walked in, his face was grim. He carried a folder under his arm, and the weight in his eyes told me he had found something significant. "Dorothy," he began, setting the folder on the desk, "you need to brace yourself. What I've uncovered isn't just about infidelity, it's much worse." My stomach sank. Grace reached out and squeezed my hand, her silent way of telling me I wasn't alone. "Tell me," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Ethan opened the folder, revealing photos, documents, and transaction records. "Adam and Chloe aren't just having an affair," he explained. "They're business partners, illegal business partners. They've been running fraudulent schemes, laundering money, and even funneling funds into offshore accounts." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're saying Adam's a criminal?" Ethan nodded. "And he's been doing this for years. It's likely he's been using his legitimate business as a front. Chloe isn't just his mistress. She's his accomplice. Together, they've built a web of lies and illegal activities." The room felt like it was spinning. This was the man I had trusted with my life, the father of my child. I had suspected betrayal, but I never imagined this level of deceit. "How do you know all of this?" I asked, struggling to process the information. Ethan gestured to the documents. I traced his financial transactions, interviewed a few of his former employees, and dug into public records. Everything here points to their involvement in criminal activities. They've even been under the radar of federal authorities, but so far, they've managed to avoid detection. Grace leaned forward, her voice firm. "Dorothy, this changes everything. Adam isn't just a cheater, he's a criminal. You need to protect yourself and Sophia. We have to take this to the authorities." I nodded, the anger in me boiling to the surface. Adam had destroyed our family, abandoned his child, and now I found out he had been living a double life as a fraudster. "What do we do?" I asked, determined to fight back. Grace and Ethan shared a glance before Ethan spoke. "We start by building a case. The evidence I've gathered is solid, but we'll need more to ensure he and Chloe face justice. You'll need a lawyer, a good one. Grace didn't hesitate. I know someone who can help. Let me make a call. That's how I met Megan, a sharp and determined lawyer who specialized in cases like mine. She was in her early 40s, with a calm confidence that immediately put me at ease. Dorothy, she said during our first meeting, you've been through hell, but we're going to turn this around. With the evidence Ethan has collected, we can not only expose Adam's crimes but also ensure you and Sophia get what you deserve. Over the next few days, Megan and Ethan worked tirelessly to strengthen the case. Megan filed for an emergency order to protect me and Sophia, while Ethan coordinated with local authorities to bring Adam's illegal activities to light. I was overwhelmed by the support I received from Grace, from Megan, from Ethan. For the first time since Adam had kicked us out, I felt a glimmer of hope. The turning point came when Ethan orchestrated a raid on one of Adam's business properties. With the help of law enforcement, they caught Adam and Chloe red-handed, finalizing a fraudulent deal. The arrest was swift, and the news spread quickly. Watching the footage of Adam being led away in handcuffs was surreal. This man, who had once been the center of my world, now looked like a stranger. When Megan called to tell me the charges against Adam and Chloe were solid, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that justice was finally catching up to them, but sadness for the life Sophia and I had lost. Still, I knew we couldn't move forward until this chapter was closed. The court date was set, and Megan assured me we had a strong case. Dorothy, she said, you're going to have to testify. The court needs to hear your story, the sacrifices you've made, the betrayal you've endured. Are you ready for that? I hesitated, the thought of standing in front of a judge and strangers daunting. But then I looked at Sophia, playing happily in the corner of the room, her laughter a reminder of what I was fighting for. Yes, I said, my voice steady. I'm ready. As the trial approached, I steeled myself for the battle ahead. Adam had tried to break me, to destroy our family, but I wasn't going to let him win. With Megan, Grace, and Ethan by my side, I knew I had the strength to face him and to ensure that justice was served. What I didn't know was just how much this fight would test every ounce of resilience I had left. The day of the trial arrived. Standing outside the courthouse, I held Sophia's hand tightly. Her wide eyes looked up at me, full of trust, reminding me why I had to face this day. It was for her, for our future. Grace and Megan stood beside me, their support unwavering. Moments later, Ethan joined us, his calm confidence reassuring. We've got this, Dorothy, he said. The evidence is solid. As we entered the courtroom, my heart raced. The room's grandeur, with its towering judges' bench and rows of seats, was intimidating. Across the room, Adam sat with Chloe, their lawyers flanking them. Adam caught my eye and smirked, as though it were all a game. I suppressed my anger, focusing instead on Sophia, who was safely seated with Grace in the gallery. The trial began with opening statements. Megan's voice was steady and authoritative as she outlined the case. Adam's betrayal, his illegal activities, and his abandonment of his family. Listening to her, I felt a surge of pride. This fight was no longer mine alone. It was a united effort to reveal the truth. When my turn came to testify, my legs felt weak as I approached the stand. Swearing to tell the truth, I recounted everything: Sophia's illness, Adam's indifference, and the heartbreak of selling my jewelry to save her. My voice trembled as I described returning home to find him with Chloe and his cruel decision to throw us out. The courtroom was silent, every eye on me. Drawing strength from Sophia's smile in the gallery, I answered Megan's questions honestly, holding nothing back. Adam's defense tried to portray him as a misunderstood businessman, claiming I had overreacted and that his relationship with Chloe was a private matter. But Megan was relentless. She dismantled his arguments piece by piece, presenting undeniable evidence of his fraudulent schemes. Ethan's meticulous work had left no loopholes. At one point, Megan asked, "Mr. Johnson, why did you ignore your wife's pleas for help when your daughter was critically ill?" Adam squirmed, his charm faltering. "I was busy," he muttered. "Busy with Chloe, perhaps?" Megan pressed, holding up evidence of his luxury resort stays during Sophia's surgery. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and Adam's face flushed red. Chloe's testimony sealed their fate. Under pressure, she admitted her involvement in the fraudulent activities, implicating Adam further. By the end, their web of lies had completely unraveled. Judge Walker, stern and meticulous, reviewed the evidence carefully. Her verdict was firm. This court finds Adam Johnson and Chloe Reed guilty of multiple counts of fraud and money laundering. Their actions were not only illegal but reprehensible, showing blatant disregard for family and the law. She turned to me, her tone softer. Mrs. Johnson, your courage in coming forward is commendable. This court awards you full custody of Sophia and all legal assets belonging to Mr. Johnson, excluding those tied to his crimes. Tears streamed down my face. Adam and Chloe received long-term prison sentences. Justice had been served, and the weight of betrayal began to lift. Outside, Grace hugged me tightly. You did it, Dorothy. You stood up for Sophia and yourself. Ethan, his serious demeanor softened by satisfaction, said, You've earned this victory. As we drove back to the shelter, peace washed over me. Sophia slept in her car seat, her tiny hand clutching mine even in her dreams. Grace smiled at me. What's next for you? A fresh start, I said with determination. A home for Sophia and me, where we can be safe and happy. In the weeks that followed, small victories brought new hope. Grace helped me find a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Megan guided me in managing the assets, ensuring financial security. I began volunteering at the shelter, giving back to the place that had saved us. One evening, as I tucked Sophia into bed, she asked softly, Mommy, are we happy now? Stroking her hair, I replied, Yes, sweetheart. We're happy and safe. This is just the beginning of a beautiful life. That night, sitting in our little living room, I reflected on our journey. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight for justice, it had all led to this moment. I wasn't the same woman I'd been. Stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever, I looked forward to giving Sophia the life she deserved. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. When I exposed my stepmom's fraudulent scheme, she was furious and pushed me hard from the top of the stairs. I fell and was badly injured. She wanted to end my life and take control of my inheritance. Little did she know, my revenge would strike back harder than she could ever imagine, leaving her powerless at my feet. My life changed in a way I never saw coming. It's funny how you can think you know someone, trust them even, only to find out that trust was never mutual. If you had told me a year ago that my own family would turn against me, I wouldn't have believed you. But now, sitting here today, I know better. It all started when my father passed away. Richard Carter, successful, respected, larger than life. To me, though, he was just Dad. He always had this way of making the world feel safer. He taught me to ride a bike, to stand up for myself, and even helped me paint my first mural on the wall of our garage. That's who he was, my hero. And when he died, it felt like my whole world fell apart. I still remember that day so vividly. The phone call came early in the morning. I was sipping my coffee, sketching out ideas for a new project, when I heard Sophia's voice crack on the other end of the line. She didn't even need to say it. I could hear it in her tone. My dad was gone. A heart attack, they said. Sudden and unexpected. The shock of it didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly, like a fog settling over my mind. A week later, we gathered at the Carter estate in Chicago for the funeral. Our family home felt so different without him, empty, like a shell of what it used to be. People came and went, offering condolences, but all I could focus on was how everything seemed to be slipping through my fingers. My stepmother, Vera, was hosting the reception, playing the role of the grieving widow. She looked elegant, as always, dressed in black, with her perfectly manicured hands gripping a glass of wine. But something about her felt off. Detached, maybe? Or maybe it was just me, reading too much into things in my grief. I tried to be civil with Vera. After all, she had been a part of our lives for over a decade. She married my dad when I was 15, and while we never had the warmest relationship, we got along well enough. Or so I thought. It was a few days after the funeral when things started to feel strange. Vera called me into my father's office to discuss some paperwork. I didn't think much of it at first. She handed me a stack of documents and asked me to sign them, saying they were just formalities related to the estate. Her voice was calm, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Chloe, darling, we need to get this sorted out quickly. It's what your father would have wanted," she said, tapping the papers with one of her blood-red nails. I hesitated. "What are these exactly?" "Oh, nothing complicated. Just transferring some assets. You don't need to read through all the legal jargon. Just sign here, here, and here." Her tone was smooth, almost too smooth. That's when my gut told me something was wrong. My dad always told me to trust my instincts, so I decided to stall. "I'll need some time to look these over," I said, trying to sound casual. Her expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she regained her composure. "Of course, take your time," she said, but I could feel the tension in her voice. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the whole situation gnawed at me. Why was she so eager for me to sign those papers? And why didn't she explain what they were for? The next morning, I called Peter Hughes, an old family friend and my dad's retired lawyer. Peter had known my father for years and was someone I trusted completely. When Peter arrived at the estate later that day, he had a sealed envelope with him. "Your father asked me to give this to you if anything ever happened to him," he explained, handing it over. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. "Chloe, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. I need you to know something important. The estate and everything tied to it rightfully belong to you. Your mother set up a trust before she passed, ensuring you would always be taken care of. I've kept this arrangement in place, but I suspect Vera may try to challenge it. Be cautious, my darling. Trust Peter and trust yourself. I know you'll do what's right. Love always, Dad." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My father knew. He knew Vera couldn't be trusted. I looked up at Peter, who nodded solemnly. "Your father was a smart man. He wanted to make sure you were protected." I spent the rest of the day trying to process everything. Vera wasn't just pushing me to sign papers. She was trying to take what wasn't hers. The thought of it made my blood boil. I couldn't let her get away with it. But I also knew I needed to be careful. Vera was cunning, and if my father's letter was any indication, she was already plotting something bigger. That night, I confided in Sophia, my best friend since college. Over the years, Sophia had become more like a sister to me. She was a journalist, sharp and relentless when it came to uncovering the truth. If anyone could help me figure out what Vera was up to, it was her. "I knew there was something off about that woman," Sophia said after I showed her the letter. "Don't worry, Chloe. We'll get to the bottom of this." As I sat there with Sophia, a mix of fear and determination swirling inside me, I realized this was just the beginning. My father had trusted me to protect his legacy, and I wasn't about to let him down. Little did I know, the fight ahead would test me in ways I never imagined. The days that followed were some of the most unsettling of my life. After reading my father's letter, I couldn't shake the feeling that Vera was always watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The Carter estate no longer felt like my home. It felt like a battleground. Sophia wasted no time diving into the investigation. "Chloe, if what your dad said in that letter is true, Vera might already be taking steps to cover her tracks. We need to find proof, anything that shows what she's been up to," she told me over coffee at my kitchen table. I nodded. "I don't know where to start, but I have to do this. For my dad. For my mom's legacy." That night, Sophia and I started combing through my father's old office. It was a strange experience, sitting in the space where he had spent so much of his time building the Carter legacy. The scent of his cologne still lingered faintly, and his desk was neatly organized, as though he had only stepped away for a moment. Sophia found it first, a folder tucked away in a locked drawer. It took a few tries, but I managed to guess the combination. Inside were copies of financial statements, legal documents, and handwritten notes. One note stood out: trust, sole beneficiary, Chloe. It was dated a few months before my father passed. My heart ached as I imagined him meticulously preparing everything to protect me. "This is it," Sophia said, holding up the document. "This proves you're the rightful heir." I let out a shaky breath. It's a start. But it doesn't explain what Vera's been up to. We didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, Peter called me. "Chloe, I've been going over some of the estate records, and there are irregularities, transfers, and withdrawals that don't make sense. Some of the assets seem to have been liquidated, but the money isn't accounted for." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already had an idea. "It means someone is tampering with the estate." "My guess? Vera?" My stomach churned. "How do we prove it?" "Keep looking for anything unusual, emails, transactions, anything that might connect her to these irregularities. And be careful, Chloe. If Vera suspects you know, she could become dangerous." Dangerous. The word stuck with me. Vera had always been calculating, but I'd never thought of her as someone who would hurt me. At least, not physically. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized how far she might go to get what she wanted. One evening, I was alone in the estate, flipping through old security footage from the house's surveillance system. Most of it was uneventful, staff going about their duties, Vera hosting her endless string of social events. But then, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the footage, Vera was in my father's office, rifling through his desk. This was days after his death. She pulled out a document, glanced at it, and smiled, a cold, satisfied smile that sent a chill down my spine. Then she handed it to someone just out of the frame. I rewound the footage and froze it. The man was tall, wearing a dark suit. I didn't recognize him, but Sophia did. "That's Ronald Pierce," she said when I showed her the still image the next morning. "He's a notorious lawyer, shady as they come. He's been involved in cases of fraud and forgery before, but nothing's ever stuck. This can't be a coincidence." It wasn't. As Sophia dug deeper, she found a trail linking Pierce to Vera. He had been helping her siphon money from the estate into offshore accounts. Vera wasn't just trying to take the estate, she was dismantling it piece by piece. I confronted her that night. It was reckless, I know that now, but I was angry and scared. She was in the sitting room, sipping her usual glass of red wine, when I walked in. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. Vera looked up at me with a raised eyebrow. "About what, dears?" "I know what you've been doing," I said, holding up a folder of documents Sophia had helped me compile. "The embezzlement, the forged signatures, the fake sales. I have proof."
For a moment, she looked surprised.
Then she laughed, a soft, cruel sound. "Chloe, you've been busy, haven't you? But let me give you some advice. Proof means nothing if you don't have the power to back it up." Her words shook me more than I wanted to admit. But I didn't back down. "You're not going to get away with this," I said, turning to leave. I didn't make it far. As I reached the staircase, I felt her hand grab my arm. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she hissed, her nails digging into my skin. Then, in one swift motion, she shoved me. My body tumbled down the stairs, hitting each step with a sickening thud. I landed in a crumpled heap at the bottom, pain radiating through me. When I opened my eyes, Vera was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at me with a cold, detached expression. "Stay out of my way," she said before turning and walking away. I don't remember much after that. Sophia found me later and called an ambulance. I was bruised and battered, but alive. And as I lay in that hospital bed, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let Vera win. Whatever it took, I would fight for my father's legacy and for justice. Waking up in that hospital bed was a moment I'll never forget. Every inch of my body ached, and the memories of Vera pushing me down the stairs replayed in my mind like a bad dream. Except it wasn't a dream, it was real. She had made it clear that she wasn't afraid to hurt me to get what she wanted. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about survival. Sophia was by my side when I woke up, her face a mixture of relief and anger. "I can't believe she did this to you," she said, gripping my hand tightly. "Chloe, this has gone too far." We need to go to the police. I wanted to. Every fiber of my being wanted to see Vera in handcuffs. But I also knew it wasn't that simple. Vera was cunning, and she had people like Ronald Pierce working for her. If we went to the police without solid evidence, she'd twist the story and make me look like the villain. I needed something undeniable, something that would leave her with no way out. That's when I remembered the security cameras. Sophia, the house has surveillance cameras, I said, my voice hoarse. There might be footage of what happened. She nodded immediately. I'll get Peter to help. You focus on recovering. Over the next few days, as I healed, Sophia and Peter worked tirelessly to gather everything we needed. Peter pulled strings to access financial records, while Sophia combed through hours of security footage. They were relentless, and their determination kept me going. I couldn't have done any of this without them. Finally, a breakthrough came. Sophia walked into my hospital room one afternoon, holding a laptop. You're going to want to see this, she said, setting it down on the tray table in front of me. I pressed play, and there it was, clear footage of Vera pushing me down the stairs. My stomach churned as I watched it, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. We had proof. She couldn't deny this. That's not all, Sophia said, opening another folder on her laptop. Peter found more evidence of her financial schemes. Bank statements, forged signatures, everything we need to expose her. As I stared at the mountain of evidence we had gathered, I felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we might actually win this fight. But I also knew the hardest part was still ahead. The will reading was just a few days away, and Vera would undoubtedly try to use it to solidify her claim to the estate. If we were going to stop her, we needed to be prepared. Peter arranged for a meeting with a family lawyer, someone who had worked with my father for years and could help us navigate the legal battle ahead. When the day of the will reading finally arrived, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. The family and legal representatives gathered in the grand sitting room of the Carter estate. Vera was there, of course, dressed in a sleek black suit and exuding her usual confidence. She glanced at me briefly, her lips curling into a smug smile. I met her gaze, refusing to back down. The reading began, and as expected, Vera presented forged documents claiming full ownership of the estate. She spoke with an air of authority, as though she had already won. Richard trusted me to handle the estate, she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. These documents confirm his wishes. But just as the lawyer was about to move forward, Peter stood up. I'm afraid that's not true, he said, holding up a folder. We have evidence to the contrary. The room fell silent as Peter laid out everything, the surveillance footage, the financial records, and my father's letter naming me as the rightful heir. As the evidence was presented, Vera's confident facade began to crack. She tried to interrupt, claiming the documents were fake, but the lawyer silenced her. Then came the final blow. Ronald Pierce, her lawyer and accomplice, had been called to testify. Under pressure and facing the risk of his own arrest, he confessed to everything, how Vera had hired him to forge documents, siphon money, and sell assets illegally. His testimony was the nail in the coffin. Vera's face turned pale as the reality sank in. The lawyer turned to me, his tone respectful. Chloe, as per your father's wishes, the estate and all its assets are legally yours. I couldn't speak for a moment. The weight of everything that had happened hit me all at once. I had done it. I had honored my father's legacy and protected what he had built. But it wasn't over yet. As the legal proceedings wrapped up, the police arrived to arrest Vera. She glared at me as they led her away, her eyes filled with hatred. This isn't over, she hissed, but I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. As I stood in the grand sitting room, surrounded by the people who had helped me through this ordeal, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was my family's legacy, and I was ready to rebuild it. Watching Vera being led away in handcuffs was surreal. I had spent so much time worrying, fighting, and doubting myself that I hadn't imagined what victory would feel like. But there it was, justice, in its purest form. The woman who had tried to destroy everything my father worked for was finally being held accountable. After the will reading, I took some time to process everything. I met with Peter and Sophia, who had been my rocks through all of this. I also had an unexpected conversation with my half-brother, Jake. He had been distant for years, ever since our father married Vera. I'd always believed he sided with her, but now I realized he was just as manipulated as I had been. "Chloe," Jake began, his voice hesitant. "I didn't know about any of this. Vera, she had me convinced you were trying to take everything for yourself. I should have known better." I studied his face, searching for sincerity, and found it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way his eyes avoided mine. He wasn't the enemy. He was just another victim of Vera's lies.
"It's not your fault, Jake," I said. "She fooled all of us."
He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I want to make things right. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." His offer surprised me, but it also gave me hope. For the first time in years, I felt like we could rebuild our relationship and the Carter legacy together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Taking control of the estate was no small task. Peter helped me navigate the legal complexities, ensuring that every last piece of Vera's embezzlement was uncovered and undone. The more we uncovered, the more horrified I became at the extent of her greed. Millions of dollars had been funneled into secret accounts, and parts of the estate had been sold under fraudulent pretenses. It would take time to recover everything, but at least now I was in control. I also made a decision about the estate that would honor both of my parents' memories. My father had built this empire from the ground up, but my mother had always been passionate about giving back. She was an artist, and some of my earliest memories were of sitting beside her as she painted. Inspired by her, I decided to convert part of the estate into a community art center. It would be a place where local artists could create, learn, and showcase their work, a way to give back to the city that had supported my family for generations. Sophia, of course, loved the idea. "Your mom would be so proud," she said when I told her. "And your dad, too. This is exactly the kind of legacy they would have wanted." Jake surprised me by offering to help fund the project. "I want to contribute," he said. "This family has a lot of repairing to do, but maybe this is a way to start." Together, we began transforming the estate. It wasn't easy. Every step was a reminder of the chaos Vera had left behind. But with each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more confident. The art center began to take shape, and I knew it was the right decision. This was more than just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, creativity, and hope. As the project moved forward, I also testified in the trial against Vera. Seeing her in court, facing the consequences of her actions, was bittersweet. Part of me felt sorry for her, not for what she had done, but for the emptiness that must have driven her greed. She had destroyed herself in her quest for power, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The trial ended with Vera being convicted of fraud, embezzlement, and assault. She was sentenced to several years in prison, and Ronald Pierce received his own punishment for his role in her schemes. Justice had been served, and for the first time in months, I could breathe freely. When the art center finally opened, it was a celebration like no other. Friends, family, and local artists gathered at the estate to see what we had created. Standing on the steps of the newly renovated building, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. My father's legacy was secure, and my mother's spirit lived on in every brushstroke, every sculpture, every artist who walked through those doors. Jake stood beside me, smiling as we watched the crowd.
"You did it," he said.
"We did it," I corrected him. "This is just the beginning." As I looked around, surrounded by the people who had stood by me through everything, I realized how far I had come. Vera's betrayal had tested me in ways I never imagined, but it had also shown me the strength of loyalty, perseverance, and family. In the end, I hadn't just reclaimed my inheritance. I had reclaimed my life, my purpose, and my future. Standing there, with the sun setting behind the Carter estate, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. When I gave birth to twin daughters, my cruel husband and mother-in-law burst out in anger. "You never give us good news," my husband shouted as he struck me and threw divorce papers in my face before leaving me alone. I cried for help, but they both abandoned me with my newborns. Desperate, I called my elder brother, and before they could return home, a shocking surprise awaited them. "Hi, I'm Laura. My story is not something I imagined I'd ever share, but perhaps someone out there might learn from it or find strength in it." I was 29, living in a suburban city and married to Ryan, my college classmate. Our love story seemed perfect, almost like a fairy tale. We met during our final year at university, bonded over shared dreams, and before long, we were inseparable. After graduation, we decided to take the next step and got married. The first few years of our marriage were beautiful. Ryan worked as a businessman, managing his import-export ventures, while I took care of our home. I loved our life together and was genuinely happy. Ryan seemed to adore me, always promising me a bright future. His mother, Margaret, was a regular presence in our lives. She was a strong-willed woman in her mid-50s, often opinionated but generally kind, or so I thought. Things took a major turn when I found out I was pregnant. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. I couldn't wait to share the news with Ryan and Margaret. I still remember the evening vividly. Ryan had just come back from work, looking exhausted but in good spirits. Margaret had come over for dinner, which she often did. With my heart pounding with excitement, I decided to share the news over dessert. "Ryan, Margaret," I began, struggling to contain my smile. "I have some wonderful news. We're going to have a baby." Ryan's face lit up instantly, and Margaret clasped her hands together with what I believed to be genuine joy. "Oh, Laura, that's amazing," Ryan exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. Margaret nodded approvingly, adding, "This is wonderful news for the family. You've made us so proud." In that moment, I felt everything was perfect. Little did I know that this happiness was fleeting. Throughout my pregnancy, things appeared normal on the surface. Ryan attended doctor's appointments with me, and Margaret would occasionally drop by with home-cooked meals. I thought we were growing closer as a family. However, there were moments, small, seemingly insignificant at the time, where Margaret would make comments about wanting a grandson. "You know, Ryan was my firstborn," she'd say with a wistful smile. "Having a grandson would be a dream come true. Boys carry the family name, after all." Ryan would nod in agreement, and I would laugh nervously, brushing it off. "We'll be happy no matter what the baby is," I'd reply. But deep down, I started noticing a pattern in their behavior. Ryan and Margaret were increasingly fixated on the idea of having a boy. As my due date approached, my excitement was mixed with anxiety. I didn't understand why I felt uneasy. Perhaps some part of me sensed that something wasn't right. The day of my delivery finally arrived, earlier than expected. I went into labor late at night, and Ryan drove me to the hospital. Margaret insisted on coming along, and I didn't mind. I thought their presence was a sign of support. Little did I know it was anything but. The labor was long and exhausting, but when it was over, the doctor announced with a smile, "Congratulations, Laura, you've given birth to twin girls." I was overjoyed. Twin daughters. I couldn't wait to hold them and show them to Ryan. However, when Ryan and Margaret came to see me, their faces weren't filled with the joy I had anticipated. Instead, they were pale, as if the doctor had delivered terrible news. "Two girls?" Ryan muttered under his breath, his expression unreadable. Margaret, standing behind him, looked equally stunned. She whispered something to Ryan, and they both left the room without saying much. At that moment, I was too overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion to question their behavior. It wasn't until I was moved to a private room that the full weight of their reaction hit me. Ryan walked in, his face dark with anger. Before I could speak, he erupted. "You've never brought me any good news, Laura," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "Two girls? This is your fault." His words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about, Ryan? There are daughters. Beautiful, healthy babies. How can this be bad news?" But he wasn't listening. He threw a set of papers onto the bed. "This is your punishment, Laura. I'm divorcing you. I want nothing to do with you or your daughters." I was stunned into silence. My hands trembled as I picked up the papers. It was a divorce notice hastily signed. Before I could process what was happening, Margaret walked in, her face devoid of sympathy. "This was my idea, Laura," she said coldly. "You failed this family. We don't need you anymore." They both walked out, leaving me alone in the sterile hospital room. I sat there, holding the divorce papers in one hand and clutching the thin hospital blanket with the other, unable to stop the tears from falling. My heart felt shattered into a million pieces. I had been abandoned at the most vulnerable moment of my life. I sat in that hospital room for what felt like hours, holding my daughters in my arms. They were so tiny, so innocent, and yet they had been rejected by their own father and grandmother. The betrayal burned deep, but my tears dried quickly. I realized I had to do something, not just for me, but for my daughters. I couldn't let them grow up in a world where they were made to feel unwanted. That night, as I rocked my daughters to sleep, I met Dr. Olivia. She wasn't just my attending doctor. She became an unexpected source of comfort. She entered the room quietly, her face soft with concern. "Laura," she said, sitting by my bedside, "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" I shook my head, unable to find the words. Her eyes were filled with genuine empathy. "Listen, I know this isn't what you imagined for yourself, but you're not alone. There are people who care about you. If you need help, please let me know." Her kindness brought a flicker of hope to my heart. I whispered, "Thank you, Dr. Olivia. I don't know what I'll do yet, but I need to figure this out for them." I glanced down at my daughters, who were now fast asleep. The first step I took was to call my elder brother, David. He lived out of town and was a successful businessman. David had always been my protector even when we were kids. When I told him everything, how Ryan and Margaret had abandoned me and the twins, his reaction was immediate and fierce. "Laura, don't worry," he said over the phone, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're not alone in this. I'll be there for you every step of the way. Let me handle this." His words were like a balm to my shattered heart. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital and went to stay with David. He welcomed us into his home with open arms, making sure I had everything I needed for the twins. For the first time since that horrible day, I felt a sense of safety. But safety wasn't enough. I needed justice. David and I sat down one evening after the twins had fallen asleep. "Laura," he began, his tone serious, "we need to expose them for who they really are. Ryan and Margaret think they can walk away from this without consequences, but they're wrong."
"How?" I asked.
"What can we do?" "We start by finding out their secrets," David replied. "People like Ryan and Margaret don't live clean lives. They must have something to hide." David hired a private investigator, a man named Mr. Carter, who was known for his thorough and discreet work. "Give him a week," David assured me. "He'll dig up everything we need." While we waited for the investigation to unfold, I tried to adjust to my new reality. Taking care of twins was exhausting, but every smile, every tiny coup reminded me why I was fighting so hard. Dr. Olivia checked in with me regularly, offering advice and encouragement. I also found solace in speaking to David, who was my rock through it all. Exactly a week later, Mr. Carter called with news. "I've found something," he said. "Ryan and Margaret are involved in an illegal import-export operation. It's a pretty extensive setup, smuggling banned goods, evading taxes, and using shell companies to cover their tracks." The revelation shocked me. I had always known Ryan's business was successful, but I never imagined it was built on illegal activities. Margaret's involvement wasn't surprising. Her controlling nature made it clear she would do anything to maintain power. David and I decided to take immediate action. We hired a lawyer to build a strong case against them. I was hesitant at first. After all, this was the father of my children. But David's words convinced me. "Laura, they betrayed you in the worst way," he said firmly. "This isn't just about revenge. It's about ensuring they don't hurt anyone else." With the lawyer's help, we gathered all the evidence Mr. Carter had uncovered. Simultaneously, I turned to social media to expose their true nature. I was careful with my posts, sharing just enough to make people aware of what had happened without jeopardizing our legal case. The response was overwhelming. People reached out with messages of support and outrage. Many couldn't believe the cruelty I had endured, while others shared their own stories of betrayal and resilience. It was empowering to know I wasn't alone. As the case began to take shape, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for my daughters, to show them that their mother was strong and capable of standing up to injustice. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and determination. With David by my side and the lawyer guiding us, we began piecing together a case so airtight that Ryan and Margaret wouldn't have a chance to escape justice. But even with all the evidence, I knew that facing them in court wouldn't be easy. Still, I reminded myself of why I was doing this, for my daughters and for every injustice I had endured. Our private investigator, Mr. Carter, had uncovered everything we needed. The details of Ryan and Margaret's illegal import-export business were more shocking than I could have imagined. They had been smuggling banned goods into the country, using fake companies to launder money and evading taxes for years. Margaret was not just complicit. She was the mastermind behind most of the operations. It was clear now how they had managed to build their wealth. Armed with this information, our lawyer, Ms. Bennett, began preparing the legal documents. "Laura," she said during one of our meetings, "the evidence we have is solid, but their lawyers will fight back. Be prepared for a tough battle." "I'm ready," I replied firmly. I didn't have the luxury of fear or hesitation anymore. At the same time, I continued to use social media to expose the truth. My posts were carefully worded, sharing my story and hinting at the evidence without compromising the case. I described how Ryan and Margaret had abandoned me and my daughters, emphasizing their preference for a male heir and their cruel betrayal. I never mentioned the illegal activities directly, but the public outcry against their behavior was overwhelming. Comments poured in. Strangers offered their support. Women shared their own stories of betrayal, and some even volunteered to help in any way they could. The more people learned, the more they stood with me. It felt like I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for all the women who had faced similar injustices. Then came the day we filed the case in court. It was a surreal moment, watching the evidence we had gathered turn into an official document that would bring Ryan and Margaret to justice. The charges included financial fraud, tax evasion, smuggling, and abandonment. But filing the case was only the first step. Ryan and Margaret's lawyers immediately responded with counterclaims, accusing me of defamation and trying to tarnish their reputation out of spite. I wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of tactic I expected from them. Their arrogance was their downfall. They believed they were untouchable. The court date was set, but in the meantime, I faced another challenge. Margaret, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, tried to manipulate the narrative. She reached out to family members and mutual friends, spinning lies about me. According to her, I was an ungrateful wife who had always sought to ruin their family. Some people believed her, but others, knowing her manipulative nature, stood by me. David was my anchor during this time. "Laura," he said one evening, "don't let her get to you. The truth will come out, and when it does, she won't be able to hide anymore." Meanwhile, the media began picking up on the story. News outlets caught wind of my social media posts and the upcoming trial, and the coverage only amplified the public's interest. The more attention the case received, the more pressure it put on Ryan and Margaret. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. I walked into the courtroom with David and Ms. Bennett by my side, feeling a mixture of anxiety and determination. Ryan and Margaret were already there, their faces cold and impassive. I couldn't tell if they were confident or just pretending, but it didn't matter. I was ready to face them. The trial was intense. Ms. Bennett presented the evidence meticulously, showing the court every detail of Ryan and Margaret's illegal activities. Bank statements, fake company records, shipping documents, it was all laid bare. Witnesses testified, including employees who had worked for their businesses and unknowingly been part of the schemes. I also took the stand, recounting my experience of being abandoned in the hospital and the emotional toll it had taken on me and my daughters. My voice trembled at times, but I didn't hold back. I wanted the court to see the truth, not just about their crimes, but about their cruelty. Ryan and Margaret's lawyers tried to discredit me, suggesting I was seeking revenge out of bitterness. But their arguments couldn't hold up against the mountain of evidence we had. By the end of the trial, it was clear that Ryan and Margaret had no defense. The judge's ruling came swiftly. Ryan and Margaret were found guilty on multiple charges, including financial crimes and abandonment. Their assets, including their home, were seized by the court. To my surprise, the court awarded the house to me as compensation for the suffering they had caused. It felt like poetic justice. The very home they had tried to build on lies was now a sanctuary for my daughters and me. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. But I knew this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a message to everyone who had ever been wronged, showing them that it's possible to fight back and win. The moment I stepped out of that courtroom, a flood of emotions washed over me. Relief, pride, and a renewed sense of purpose coursed through me as I held my daughters tightly in my arms. Justice had been served, and the people who had betrayed me were finally held accountable for their actions. But this wasn't just about the courtroom victory. It was about reclaiming my life and building a future for my daughters. The news of the trial's outcome spread quickly, amplified by the media attention and my social media posts. People who had followed my journey cheered for my victory. Strangers messaged me, thanking me for standing up and sharing my story. Some told me they found the courage to leave toxic relationships because of what I had done. It was overwhelming to realize the ripple effect of my actions, and I felt deeply grateful for the support. As for Ryan and Margaret, their downfall was swift and merciless. The court's decision left them without the wealth and power they had so carefully built through their illegal activities. Ryan's business empire crumbled, and Margaret's reputation, once carefully maintained, was in shambles. They both faced jail time for their crimes, ensuring they couldn't hurt anyone else. The very people who once stood by their side now distanced themselves, disgusted by the truth that had come to light. The house that the court awarded me became a new chapter for my daughters and me. Walking into it for the first time as its rightful owner was a surreal experience. This was the same house where I had once dreamed of building a happy family with Ryan. Now, it was a symbol of my resilience, a place where I could raise my daughters in peace and safety. David stayed by my side throughout the entire transition. His unwavering support was the foundation of my strength, and I would never forget the role he played in helping me fight back. "You did it, Laura," he said one evening as we unpacked boxes in my new home. "You've shown them and the world just how strong you are." But even with justice served, I knew my journey wasn't over. Healing from the betrayal and rebuilding my life would take time. I started therapy to work through the emotional scars left by Ryan and Margaret. My therapist helped me process the pain, teaching me how to let go of the anger and focus on the love I had for my daughters. I also found support in a community of women who had faced similar challenges. Together, we shared our stories, encouraging one another to keep moving forward. It was through these connections that I realized the importance of using my experience to help others. That's when I decided to dedicate part of my time to advocacy. I began writing more about my journey, sharing the lessons I had learned, and offering advice to others who might be trapped in toxic relationships. My social media presence grew, and soon I was invited to speak at events and support groups. Each time I shared my story, I felt a little stronger, a little more free. My daughters, now thriving and full of life, became my greatest joy. Watching them grow reminded me of why I had fought so hard. I wanted them to know that their mother stood up for what was right, that I didn't back down even when the odds were against me. They deserved a life free from fear, and I was determined to give them that. One evening, as I sat in the living room of our new home, watching my daughters play, I reflected on how far I had come. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it had become a part of my story, a reminder of my strength and resilience. Dr. Olivia, who had been there for me from the beginning, visited one day. She smiled as she looked around the house, her eyes lighting up at the sight of my daughters. "Laura," she said, "you've built something beautiful here. I always knew you had it in you." Her words stayed with me. I had been broken, betrayed, and abandoned, but I had risen from it all. My story wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life and turning my pain into power. And now, I was ready for whatever the future held, knowing that I had the strength to face it all. This is my story, a journey of betrayal, resilience, and justice. It wasn't easy, but I learned that even in the darkest moments, there is light if you fight for it. My daughters and I have found our light, and I hope my story inspires others to find theirs too.